Chapter 726. If one wanted to stand out from the crowd of roadside stalls, a unique and fragrant aroma was clearly a very good trump card, as it would make all of the customers around them curious about what they were selling. To the people of Rodu, roast meat wasn't a very rare delicacy, but the aroma of this roast meat immediately attracted the attention of everyone around them. This was the aroma of roast meat, but it wasn't the aroma of ordinary roast meat. It was very difficult to imagine that roast meat could exude such a delectable aroma. Even Carrie's rotisserie didn't have such an alluring aroma. Everyone turned toward Meg's stall and craned their necks to see what he had added to his roast meat. They're clearly roasting the same piece of beef, so how could there be such a huge difference in the aroma? This is incredible. Sinclair stood off to the side with wide eyes as he stared at the sizzling pieces of beef on the grill with incredulity etched on his face. He had thought that his roast meat was already quite good, but after seeing Meg's roast meat, he was suddenly struck by a sense of wonder. His roast meat was simply rotten. The waiter from Carrie's rotisserie swallowed his saliva as he pursed his lips and said, "Even though it smells good, it's definitely nowhere near as delicious as Chef Ike's roast meat. Besides, there's only one chef in this tiny stall. How could he possibly be able to serve as many customers as Carrie's rotisserie? It smells so good. Is this really roast meat?" Irina took a whiff of the aroma, and her eyes lit up as she looked at Meg's departing figure with a peculiar expression. Could it be that he really has learned how to cook? Father really is a super good cook. If big sister Irina joins our family, we'll be able to eat Father's cooking every day, Amy said with a seductive expression as she looked at Irina. Irina looked at Amy with an exasperated smile as she said, "Little girl, do you want to introduce all of the pretty big sisters to your father?" Amy shook her head with a serious expression as she replied, "No, I don't. I think only big sister Irina is worthy of Father. I've never introduced any big sisters to Father before." "Really?" Irina was a little skeptical. "Really?" Amy nodded, her big blue eyes full of calmness. "What about your mother? Did your father tell you about it?" Irina asked in a low voice. "Father said that Mother is on the moon. Every night, I can see the moon just like Mother." Amy pointed to the sky and looked at Irina with a smile. "I think my mother must be as beautiful as big sister Irina. Father is usually too lonely by himself, so I wanted to introduce him to you. Father is really super nice. What a good child." Irina looked at Amy. The little girl was so well behaved that her heart ached for her. She reached out and gently stroked her hair, saying gently, "Your mother must be very beautiful. She must be very happy to see that you've grown up. It won't be long before she comes to see you." Amy's eyes lit up. She looked at Irina and said in surprise, "Really? Big sister Irina, could it be that you know my mother?" "That's right. Your mother is the most beautiful elf in the entire elf tribe. Of course I know her. She's also super powerful. There aren't many people in this city who can defeat her." Irina nodded proudly. "Wow! So Mother is so powerful." Amy's eyes were sparkling, and her little face was full of admiration. "Yes, she's very powerful, so she'll come to your side sooner or later." Irina nodded with a smile. She then looked at Meg's back and said, "So, what you have to do now is keep a close eye on your father. Don't let other women get close to him with strange intentions. Otherwise, when your mother comes back, he might be beaten to death." "Is she that scary? Father might not be able to defeat Mother." Amy's eyes widened, as if she had already sensed the severity of the situation. She nodded earnestly and said, "All right, I'll keep a close eye on Father and chase away all the women with ulterior motives." That's good." Irina nodded with satisfaction. "But big sister Irina, what do you mean by ulterior motives?" Amy asked with a perplexed expression. It's... Irina looked at Amy, but she didn't know how to explain it. You mean those women who say things like, Mr. Mac, I want to have your babies, Mr. Mac, I want to marry you, and, Mr. Mac, give me another bowl of tofu pudding, and I'll warm your bed. Amy asked again. Irina's eyes narrowed slightly, and a dangerous aura surged within them. It seemed that things were worse than she had imagined. Were these women trying to get themselves killed? These women should be given a fireball to teach them what shame is, Irina said with clenched fists. But if I do that, I'll have to burn a lot of people to death every day, and Father won't be happy. Amy jabbed her fingers together with a conflicted expression. But is he really that popular with women? This piece of wood. Irina looked at Meg with a skeptical expression. It was a completely unfamiliar side profile, and the contours of his face were softer than those of Alex's. The way he was focused on roasting meat made her lose focus for a moment. His appearance was rather similar to when he was practicing swordsmanship all those years ago. But now, he was using this focus on cooking. She could no longer sense any powerful energy fluctuations from his body. In fact, she felt that he was very frail. Even though he had survived the ambush 3 years ago, she was very pleased that he was able to recover to his current state after having his limbs and meridians crippled. Let me protect you from now on, Alex, Irina said with a slightly entranced expression. Meg made his way over to Irina with a plate of roast meat, and he placed it in front of her with a smile as he said, have a taste of this freshly roasted beef. See if it's to your liking. The freshly roasted beef was still sizzling with oil, and the aroma of beef and black pepper wafted toward them. There was a bamboo skewer protruding from each of the 2-centimeter cubes of beef, and the entire plate was filled to the brim with meat. The aroma is so alluring, but I wonder how it tastes. It looks very delicious, but it's a little expensive to charge a silver coin for just one small piece of beef. Indeed, it's not even cheaper than the roast meat from Carrie's rotisserie. Everyone at the roast meat stall was discussing quietly among themselves as they looked at the roast meat placed in front of Irina and Amy. Chapter 727. Amy's face was full of joy as she ate the roast beef. After swallowing the beef, she stuck out her little pink tongue to lick the sauce on her lips, and a sweet smile appeared on her face. I'll risk my life to taste Alex's roast beef. Irina glanced at the smiling Meg before picking up a piece of beef with a bamboo skewer. The aroma of the roast beef wafted into her nose, and it was even more intense than the roast beef made with bean sprouts. The sauce had been applied very evenly, and the surface of the roast meat glistened with a faint oily sheen. It looked very delicate. She gently blew on the hot air before taking a bite. This taste is incredible. Irina's face immediately lit up. The slightly charred skin and the garlic-flavored sauce melted in her mouth as soon as the beef entered her mouth. The usual pungent garlic flavor was particularly gentle and delicious at this moment, and it made her mouth water. After chewing carefully, the tender beef melted in her mouth, and the aroma of garlic and meat wafted out from the meat. The deliciousness instantly blossomed in her mouth, and she could feel her taste buds cheering with every bite. It was impossible to stop. Phew! This beef is so delicious, I almost chewed my own tongue. It's incredible. I can't believe there's someone in this world who can make such delicious beef. And this person is Alex. Irina looked at Meg with amazement in her eyes. However, she only hesitated for a short while because she couldn't help but pick up a second piece of beef with a bamboo skewer. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the feeling of the delicious beef exploding in her mouth. Her pink lips parted slightly, and she bit into the tender beef as a smile of enjoyment spread across her beautiful face. Gulp, the sound of saliva being swallowed rang out, and it was quite a big commotion. Do they all have to eat so seductively? I feel like the owner is cheating. I can't take it anymore. I feel like I'm going to be melted by her cuteness. I suddenly want a daughter. Her smile is so adorable. Here's the beef skewers. I want to steal the owner's daughter away. Even such a beautiful elf likes to eat beef, so it must be worthy of my temperament. Owner, please give me a beef cube. When the passers-by saw Amy and Irina eating barbecued meat, there was already a commotion. This. Sinclair gulped as he looked at the roast beef cubes in front of Amy and Irina with a curious expression. This was roast beef that had been made from his own ingredients, and he couldn't help but wonder just how delicious it would be. Once you're done, we'll start collecting the money. Meg handed a small plate to Sinclair. There were 5 pieces of beef on it. Okay, thank you, Mr. Mac. Cindy held the plate happily. Gulp. The waiter from Carrie Rue, who was standing at the side, made a clear gulping sound. He slowly turned his head with an awkward expression, and his throat unconsciously moved twice. If you really want to eat it, you can buy it yourself, Meg reminded her considerately. Humph. The waiter from Carrie Rue turned around. He was so angry that his shoulders were shaking. Oh. The smell of roast beef. It's simply invincible. Who would have thought that truly delicious roast beef would taste like this? In comparison, my roast beef doesn't even deserve to be called roast beef. If I had tasted such delicious roast beef earlier, I wouldn't have come here to set up a roast beef stall. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call my roast beef the best in the world. Sinclair held the plate in his hands and chewed on the beef with tears streaming down his face. This bearded uncle is really full of emotions. In short, he's very dramatic. Meg shook his head with a sigh and turned around. It was best not to play along with his performance. Otherwise, who knew what kind of show he was going to put on later? Irina and Amy's double whammy had successfully made the customers, who were just here to have fun, fork out money to try Meg's roast beef. 1 silver coin wasn't a high price. Even though it was a little strange to buy a piece of beef, it wasn't a bad idea to try it out. Boss, give me a piece of beef. Boss, I want a piece too. Meg placed a new piece of beef onto the grill as he beckoned to Sinclair, who was still looking up at the sky with tears streaming down his face, to collect the money. Coming. Sinclair set down the empty plate in his hands and wiped away his tears with his apron. He immediately put on a smiling face and began to work as the cashier. In the beginning, Sinclair didn't have much confidence in Meg, but after tasting this delicious roast beef, his heart was filled with confidence. If even such delicious roast beef couldn't beat Carrie's rotisserie, then it had to be that the customers this time were too lousy and didn't know how to appreciate true delicacies. This is such a blissful feeling. Irina's bamboo skewer came into contact with the empty plate, and she was still feeling like she hadn't had enough. The delicious flavor of the roast beef was still wafting through her mouth. Could it be that he's been learning how to cook for the past 3 years? Could it be that he really doesn't like my cooking, so he's learning how to cook on his own? Irina's eyes narrowed slightly as she appraised Meg's departing figure, and she shook her head slightly. That can't be right. He said that my cooking was very delicious and that he wouldn't get sick of it no matter what, so it can't be my fault. After all, I'm still super talented at cooking. Big sister Irina, isn't father's roast beef super delicious? Amy turned to Irina with a proud smile on her little face. Yes, it is. Irina nodded with a proud look on her face. My man naturally can't be bad. The first batch of roast beef was soon ready. The roast beef was still sizzling with oil, and it was delivered directly to the customer. There was no need for seating or packaging, and the roast beef could be eaten as soon as it was purchased. It's so hot. But, it's so delicious. I've never tasted such delicious food before, the roast beef is so delicious. Even though I've never tasted roast beef from Carrie's rotisserie, this is the most delicious roast beef I've ever tasted. Boss, give me 10 more. I also want 10 more. All of the customers were heaping praises upon the roast beef, and all of them were enjoying the delicious experience that the roast beef brought to them. However, all of the customers who had finished their roast beef quickly gathered around Mag's rotisserie again and offered to buy more. My apologies, customers, but there's a limit of 1 roast beef per person. Meg stopped Sinclair from taking the money with a smile, and said, I have a bet with Carrie's rotisserie today, so there's a limit of 1 roast beef per person. If you like it, you can come to my restaurant to try it. Boss, I only want 1 roast beef. Just 1 more pill would do. You can't be so cruel. Such delicious roast beef, even if there were 100 of them, I would still be able to finish them. I've only just been provoked, and now you're telling me that I can't eat anymore. That's too cruel. A rather fat customer pleaded with a bitter expression. That's right, boss, as long as you sell us 1 more roast beef per person, we'll all support you, a tall and thin customer chimed in. Mr. Mac, why don't you just sell them 1 more roast beef? The red-faced Sinclair also chimed in. He had been running this stall for so many days, and this was the first time that he had received so much money that his hands were about to give out. This feeling of being on cloud 9 was simply too blissful. My apologies, but rules are rules. Please move on to the next customer. Meg shook his head with a smile, and it was clear that he had no intention of negotiating. Chapter 728. What? How is that possible? In the kitchen of the rotisserie, Ike exclaimed as he listened to a report from a waiter. Many of the customers in the restaurant turned toward the kitchen with perplexed looks on their faces. You're saying that the rotisserie stall only just started roasting meat, and there are already so many customers rushing over to try it? There's even a long line. The waiter nodded with an uneasy expression and replied, That's right. He sells his roast meat by cubes, and each customer can only buy 1 cube. However, there are still many customers lining up, and those who have finished their roast meat are begging him to buy more. All of the other chefs in the kitchen became rather nervous upon hearing this. This bet wasn't just about a sign, it was also about the reputation of Carrie's rotisserie. If they couldn't even compete with a roadside stall, then what right did they have to call themselves the #1 rotisserie in Rodu? Ike contemplated the situation momentarily before shaking his head with a confident expression. Don't worry, the customers aren't idiots. How can a roadside stall cook such delicious roast beef? They won't be fooled after tasting it. Let's see how many cubes of roast beef he can sell for 1 silver coin per cube. Carrie's rotisserie is the largest rotisserie in all of Rodu. All of the chef's eyes lit up upon hearing this. Indeed, how could a single person compare to their entire kitchen? This bet was about the number of customers that they could serve. The delicious roast beef quickly spread like wildfire, and many customers were attracted to the rotisserie. However, the restriction of 1 cube per person was like a fishbone that was stuck in everyone's throat. Some of the customers were still trying to convince the stubborn owner to change the restriction, while most of them had already given up. However, they didn't go too far, and some of them even offered to help promote the rotisserie. They weren't offering to help out because they were moved by the delicious roast beef. Instead, they wanted to see the depressed expressions on the customers' faces after tasting the delicious roast beef, but being unable to get a second cube. Seeing as they had already fallen into the trap, they naturally wanted more people to fall into it as well. Meg's expression was still as calm as ever as he turned down all of the customers' requests and carefully cooked every single cube of roast beef. Sinclair no longer tried to persuade Meg. His attitude was slowly changing. At first, he was worried that Meg's cold attitude would cause a loss of customers, so it was better to sell more to customers that he already liked. However, judging from the line that had already formed outside the stall, this worry was completely unnecessary. Even if each person could only buy one, the business was still booming. This kind of feeling of dominating the entire scene with delicious food really made people feel like they were floating. Even he felt like he was floating. Carrie's waiter, who was in charge of recording the customers, was completely dumbfounded. He held the quill in his hand and kept drawing vertical lines on the paper. He could hardly believe that something like this was happening right under his nose. His hand was getting sore from holding the quill, but the customers and the beef on the grill showed no signs of stopping. Carrie won't lose, right? The waiter thought uncertainly. Even he himself was not sure. What is this little stall selling? Why are there so many customers lining up here? A middle-aged man in a set of lavish robes emerged from a horse-drawn carriage, and he looked at the small stall that had been surrounded by a curious crowd. The entrance of Carrie's rotisserie was almost completely blocked off. "Duke, I'll go have a look." A man who appeared to be a butler quickly strode over to the stall. After a short while, he squeezed out of the crowd and straightened out his slightly disheveled clothes as he said in a respectful manner, "Duke, this stall is selling roast beef by the cubes, and each cube costs 1 silver coin. Furthermore, the rule is that each person can only buy 1 cube at a time. Beef is being sold by the cubes, and each person can only buy 1 cube. I didn't think that something like this would happen in this world." The man referred to as Duke was a little surprised. He looked at the barbecue stall that was surrounded by so many people that he could only see its signboard. He smiled and said, "But judging from the enthusiasm of these customers, the roast beef must be delicious. Ken, why don't we go and try it? Duke, with your status, eating from a roadside stall like this." The butler by the name of Ken faltered slightly, but the meaning behind his words was very clear. "I'm here to eat roast beef anyway." The roast beef from Carrie's rotisserie is indeed quite delicious, but perhaps I'll be pleasantly surprised if I can open a small stall right in front of it. The Duke didn't pay any heed to Ken's words as he continued onward. "Duke." Ken and his saber-wielding guard quickly caught up to him, and they surrounded him in an attempt to force the crowd to disperse. "We're here to eat, don't use your status to intimidate others." The Duke shook his head as he stopped the butler before taking his place at the very back of the line. The customers nearby were all rather surprised to see the Duke in his lavish robes. Nobles generally disdained to eat from roadside stalls with commoners as they viewed such behavior as a disgrace to their status. However, this man didn't seem to be a normal noble, but he didn't give off the impression that he was putting on airs. Furthermore, he was standing in the same line as all of the other customers. "This aroma really is making me look forward to tasting it." The Duke took a deep breath of the aroma of roast beef wafting through the air, and his eyes immediately lit up as an expectant look appeared on his face. The line continued onward, and the customers who had tasted the roast beef began to sing praises from the bottom of their hearts, tickling the hearts of the customers in the line like feathers. The Duke finally arrived at the stall, and he smiled as he said, "I'd like a cube of beef, boss." "Sure." Meg quickly picked up a cube of beef from the grill with a bamboo skewer before handing it over to the Duke. The waiter from Carrie's rotisserie was still scribbling on a piece of paper when he raised his head, and his eyes widened as he exclaimed, "Duke Abraham." "Greetings, Duke Abraham." The waiter's exclamation immediately created a stir in the crowd, and all of the surrounding customers hurriedly lowered their heads in greeting. Even a duke is coming to eat roast beef from a roadside stall. Is the owner of this stall a chef? Duke Abraham is a very prestigious figure. If he wants more roast beef, Mr. Mac won't be able to turn him down, right? That's a duke we're talking about. If the owner turns him down, he won't be able to live to see the next day. Does that mean we'll have a chance to eat a second cube of beef? All of the customers were discussing quietly among themselves with excitement etched on their faces. The waiter standing at the entrance of Carrie's rotisserie also hurriedly ran into the shop. "It's Duke Abraham." Meg also raised his head with a hint of surprise upon hearing this. Alex didn't have much of an impression of this Duke, who was a man of extremely high status but didn't hold much power. Chapter 729. Among the 10 dukes of the Roth Empire, Abraham wasn't the most powerful one, but he was undoubtedly the best when it came to the food he had eaten. He had chosen to stay in Rodu as an idle duke rather than a vast and rich territory, precisely because he couldn't bear to part with the delicious food in Rodu. If he were to go to other places, he wouldn't be able to eat such delicious food. As such, he had been given the nickname of the Duke of Gluttony. However, he wasn't ashamed of this. Instead, he was quite pleased with himself. How could ordinary people understand the joy of being a glutton? Nothing in this world was more important than delicious food. However, after taking a bite of the beef, Abraham felt as if he had seen the true meaning of life. This was what he had been pursuing all this time. The beef was charred on the outside and tender on the inside, and the juicy meat and delicious beef spread through his mouth. His taste buds began to stir violently, and a peculiar aroma slowly wafted through the air. This was the aroma of black pepper, and it elevated the flavor of the beef to a whole new level. The sizzling piece of beef collided violently in his mind. It was just a small piece of beef, but it made him feel as if a century had passed. It had been a long time since he had tasted something so delectable. Delicious. I don't even know how to describe how delicious it is. Abraham gave Meg a thumbs up with admiration in his eyes. In his eyes, a chef who could cook delicious food was like a skilled craftsman, and was worthy of praise and respect. "It's so delicious. Boss, give me 10 more cubes." Abraham looked into Meg's eyes as he spoke. "It's finally here." All of the customers' eyes lit up. Meg had rejected everyone just then, and no one had been able to get a second piece of beef from him. Now that the Duke was the one making the request, would Meg make an exception? Father won't make an exception for no good reason. Amy shook her head. Irina looked up at Meg's departing figure. "Is he still so stubborn?" "My apologies, Your Excellency, but each person is only allowed to buy 1 piece of beef at a time." Meg shook his head with a smile. Rules were rules, and if they were changed, then they would be meaningless. He refused. The customers were surprised. The Duke had personally asked, but the owner of a small stall actually refused. "You're still stubborn." A smile appeared on Irina's face. "Mr. Mac, this is the Grand Duke, the Grand Duke." Sinclair tugged on Meg's sleeve as he cautioned in a quiet voice. Sweat was dripping down his forehead from his anxiety. How could Meg treat all of these esteemed guests equally? Wasn't he afraid of losing his head? Ken looked at Meg and sternly said, "Do you know who you are talking to? How dare you talk about rules in front of the Duke?" Meg's expression remained calm as he replied, "The rules weren't made for Your Excellency, they're just a temporary rule. Due to the bet with Carrie's rotisserie, I had no choice but to follow this rule. I hope Your Excellency can forgive me." "Ken." Abraham raised a hand to signal for Ken to back down before turning to Meg with a smile, and said, "Boss, may I ask what kind of bet you have with Carrie's rotisserie? If 10 isn't enough, can you sell me another one? I was just passing by this place today." Meg gave Abraham a brief explanation of the bet. This Duke was quite amicable, and he wasn't as arrogant as the average noble. "I see. I agree with you. It would be terrible if all delicacies had to be categorized by class. There are many delicious foods hidden in the roadside stalls." Abraham nodded in agreement before casting his gaze toward Carrie's rotisserie with a smile, and said, "Seeing as you're going to take on the largest rotisserie in the United States on your own, I'm naturally not going to break your rules." Abraham pointed at Ken and the guard beside him with a smile, and said, "But those two should be able to buy a cube of beef each, right?" "Of course they can, seeing as they've lined up." Meg nodded with a smile. Abraham departed with 2 cubes of beef in his hand, and a content expression appeared on his face. Gluttons were always able to think of a way to eat delicious food. Ken quickly caught up with him with a peculiar expression on his face, and he looked at Abraham with a perplexed expression as he asked, "Aren't you going to Carrie's rotisserie, Duke? Is there a better rotisserie there?" Abraham asked with a smile. Ken didn't know how to respond. Once you've tasted a truly delicious dish, you won't be interested in any other dish. Abraham looked at the beef in his hand, and sighed as he said, "It looks like I won't be interested in rotisserie from other restaurants in the future. It's a good thing that His Excellency is a reasonable person." Cindy wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead, and he felt as if his heart were about to leap out of his throat. In contrast, Meg was as calm as a placid lake. "So this is a rule that Boss Carrie's rotisserie set up to force them to tear down the sign. Even His Excellency is following the rules, let's not add to Boss Carrie's troubles. Didn't His Excellency teach us the correct way to buy a second cube of beef? I'll go get him right away." Complex expressions appeared on the faces of the customers. They had initially wanted His Excellency to break Meg's rules, but who would have thought that His Excellency would be more obedient than anyone else? However, most of the customers in front of the stall were commoners, and they were already displeased with the signs that were plastered on the doors of noble restaurants. As such, they were very supportive of Meg's decision, and no one asked for another cube of beef from Meg. After Duke Abraham tasted the beef from the stall, he was full of praises for it. After that, he left straight away. In the kitchen of the rotisserie, Ike's expression darkened as he listened to the report from a waiter. Duke Abraham was the most esteemed customer of their rotisserie, and he was also one of the most frequent customers of the rotisserie. He was the main reason why the rotisserie was so popular, and many of the nobles came to the rotisserie because of him. However, Duke Abraham had just tasted the beef from the stall and left without even entering Carrie's rotisserie. This was very difficult for Ike to accept. The waiter continued, "Furthermore, Lord just told me that the stall has already served 135 customers, and there's already a long line of customers waiting in front of the stall. In less than an hour, they've already served over 100 customers. At this rate, they're almost catching up to the number of customers we serve in our rotisserie." A stir ran through the kitchen. All of the chefs who had been brimming with confidence were now quite dejected. Ike forced himself to calm down before waving a hand, and ordering, "Hurry up and serve more customers during peak hours." A long line extended from the entrance of Carrie's rotisserie down the street, creating an extremely eye-catching sight. This was quite a rare sight on the food street, and most importantly, this line didn't extend from Carrie's rotisserie. Instead, it extended from a small rotisserie stall, and this drew the attention of many passers-by. Irina and Amy were strolling around the food street, and when they returned, Meg was handing the last cube of beef to a customer. Chapter 730. All of the customers who had missed out on the roast beef were still lamenting, but they gradually quieted down upon hearing Meg's announcement. News of the bet between Meg and Carrie's rotisserie had already spread, and all of the customers in the line had heard a little about it. A small, obscure stall was challenging the most renowned rotisserie on the food street, and that in itself was quite a commotion. Furthermore, it was rumored that Duke Abraham had just paid a visit to this stall and was full of praise for the roast beef, but he didn't even enter Carrie's rotisserie. Now that Meg had announced the result of the bet, everyone immediately turned their attention to the waiter from Carrie's rotisserie. The waiter was beginning to panic a little at the sight of so many people staring at him, and he stuttered, "This. You don't even know how many customers our rotisserie has served. How could you win? That's bullshit. How dare a small rotisserie stall make such a claim? Our rotisserie has served a total of 735 customers in just one afternoon. How can you compare with us? Right at this moment, Ike strode out of the rotisserie with a smug and arrogant expression as he appraised Meg. The evening rush hour hadn't even begun yet, but Carrie's rotisserie had already served so many customers. Almost all of the seats in the restaurant had been filled to the brim with customers, so how could a small roadside stall compare to this? Head chef. The waiter immediately found his backbone, and he quickly made his way over to Ike's side with renewed confidence as he appraised Meg with a smug expression. Over 700 customers. Carrie's rotisserie really is one of the top 3 restaurants on the food street. All of the stall owners sighed with emotion. Even if they were to set up a stall here for an entire day, only a few of them would be able to serve 700 customers, so how were they going to compete with Carrie's rotisserie? Can the owner of this rotisserie win? All of the customers who had been quite confident were now looking at Meg with concern in their eyes. Father has never lost before. Amy said confidently without the slightest bit of worry on her face. Irina nodded in agreement. That's right, how could he lose? He's my man. Meg looked at the smug Ike with a smile, and said, actually, the total number of customers that have entered your rotisserie since noon today is 736, and I've included the baby you're holding in your arms. However, my apologies, but I sold a total of 1,472 cubes of beef this afternoon. Each person is limited to 1 cube, and none of them are duplicates. As such, I served a total of 1,472 customers, which is exactly double the number of customers that your rotisserie receives. Mag extended 2 fingers. The whole place was silent. Everyone's eyes lit up when they saw Mag's, too. How could this be? In less than 5 hours, he had received 1,472 customers. Carrie's rotisserie. A stall owner exclaimed, causing all the other stall owners to gasp in shock. On the other hand, the guests revealed gratified smiles on their faces. Speaking of which, they could be considered as part of the 1,400 plus people who had participated in and witnessed this bet. The smug smile on Ike's face instantly froze, and he glared at Meg. No. That's impossible. You're only one person. How could you serve so many customers in just 5 hours? You're lying. Meg pointed calmly at the waiter who was still holding a piece of paper in his hand. Every time you add a customer, your waiter will record a vertical line in his book. If you don't believe me, you can count how many vertical lines he's drawn. Everyone's eyes fell on the piece of paper in the waiter's hand. Sure enough, there were many vertical lines drawn on it, and they couldn't help but give Meg a thumbs up in their hearts. As expected, this owner was very meticulous. In this case, Ike wouldn't be able to go back on his word even if he wanted to. Ike turned to look at the piece of paper. There were countless vertical lines drawn on it, but no matter what, there had to be over 1,000 of them. His expression immediately darkened upon seeing this. Head chef. The waiter's voice was trembling slightly, and he was holding the piece of paper in his hand as if it were a hot potato. He wanted to throw it away, but he was also afraid that he would do something even worse. Give it to me. Ike stepped forward and snatched the piece of paper from the waiter's hand. He tore it into shreds before tossing it onto the ground. He looked at Meg with a cold smile, and said, "Now, how are you going to prove that you've served over 1,000 customers this afternoon? Are you going to serve these commoners? A lowly chef like you will only be able to cook the lowest grade roast meat for these commoners for the rest of your life. If I want to trample over you, it'll be as easy as raising my foot. You'll never be able to guess who the mastermind behind Carrie's rotisserie is." Ike wore an arrogant smile on his face, and he waved a hand through the air. A group of chefs and waiters with clubs in their hands rushed out of the rotisserie, and they pointed at Meg as they yelled, "Beat him up. You bastard. How dare you try to beat up my father? Amy glowered at the people rushing toward Meg, and she picked up a small chair from the ground. Irina also picked up a chair from somewhere, and she looked at the people with a cold expression as she said, "All of these people deserve to die. Is this enough proof?" Right at this moment, a deep voice sounded from the crowd. The pieces of paper that had been torn into shreds by Ike suddenly flew into the air, then flattened out and pieced back together in midair. The crowd parted, and a tall and thin man in a long black robe slowly strode in. He extended a hand, and the piece of paper that was hovering in midair slowly drifted down before landing on his long and slender hands. It appeared to be brand new, and there wasn't even the slightest crack on it. "What powerful spatial magic," someone on the second floor exclaimed in amazement. "It's Grandpa Principal." Amy yelled with elation as she placed the chair back onto the ground, putting on an obedient expression. Irina also casually tossed the chair aside, and pursed her lips as she said, "Old man Novin, you're still as cool as ever." The surrounding people consciously took a few steps back. This was clearly a powerful magician. Meg was also a little surprised to see this man, but he still nodded in response. "Principal Novin." Everyone from Carrie's rotisserie also stopped in their tracks upon seeing this. If this man was only a rotisserie stall owner like Meg, then they wouldn't dare to do anything. However, if this man was a powerful magic caster, then they didn't dare to do anything. Ike's heart settled a little upon seeing that Novin's robe didn't bear the insignia of the Magus Tower. He turned to Novin with a cold expression and said, Who are you? This has nothing to do with you, it's between me and him, so you better stay out of this. This is Rodu. There are some people you can't afford to mess with. Shut up. Do you know that he's the most powerful spatial magic caster on the Norland continent? You're just a lowly chef who's only fit to cook for commoners, but he's going to cook for the king tomorrow. Chapter 731. The crowd parted to reveal a lavish unicorn carriage, and a young man in a set of lavish purplish-blue robes stood atop the carriage with a cold expression on his face. "It's His Highness!" Someone in the crowd exclaimed in surprise, and a small commotion ensued. Judging from what His Highness just said, that robed man is a spatial magic caster, and the owner of that roast meat stall is going to cook for the king tomorrow. In that case, the roast meat we ate today was cooked by a chef who's going to cook for the king. I can brag about this for an entire year. Only a year. I can brag about this for the rest of my life. However, everyone was more focused on Josh's words, which had completely stunned everyone present. This. Sinclair stared at Meg with wide eyes, and he was at a complete loss for words. This feeling was akin to living in a slum, only to have someone suddenly come over and ask to stay in your house for a night, only to wake up the next day and tell you that he's actually the king. For a chef, being able to cook for the king in the palace was akin to being a king among chefs. And such a thing actually happened to him. What a miraculous day. Hearing that voice, Ike's face instantly paled. His legs trembled, and he fell to his knees uncontrollably. Ike looked at the calm and collected Mag, and he was still unable to believe that this man was going to enter the palace to cook for the king. If his culinary skills were so exceptional, and he had such a lofty status, why would he set up a stall in front of his rotisserie with those lowly commoners for the sake of a mere notice? This is simply bullying. Ike was on the verge of tears, and a sense of horror welled up in his heart as he looked at Josh, who had disembarked from the carriage and was making his way toward the roast meat shop. A great magic caster and the chef who was going to cook for the king, no matter how he thought about it, those two were far more prestigious than him. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't think of a way to extricate himself from this situation. Why is he here? Meg looked at Joshua, who had alighted from the carriage and was nodding at the commoners with a smile on his face. Then, he anxiously looked in Irina's direction. Irina, who was originally standing beside Amy, was nowhere to be seen. Meg felt slightly relieved. Although he didn't know if Irina had already guessed his and Amy's identities, judging from her behavior, she probably didn't trust Joshua too much. According to the information he had read, Irina and Joshua used to have a good friendship. "Josh, what did you do behind my back? If you really did have something to do with what happened back then, I'll kill you with my own hands," Irina murmured to herself as she stood by the window of a secluded private room. Meg withdrew his gaze and looked at Meg again, then at Ike, who was trembling uncontrollably on the ground. From the looks of it, this rotisserie most likely had something to do with Josh. Could it be that the real owner of this famous rotisserie was actually the second prince? "Your Highness." Ike's voice was trembling slightly as he lay on the ground, and he didn't dare to raise his head. "Principal Novin, I didn't think that you'd already come to Rodu. I was going to ask you some questions about magic when you arrived, but I didn't think that I would meet you here." Josh ignored Ike's words and made his way over to Novin before extending a student salute. He then turned to Ike with a cold expression and said, "This insolent commoner has no respect for his superiors. I'm going to kick him out of Rhoda today and make sure he never returns." Ike's expression changed drastically, and he kowtowed as he begged, "Your Highness. Please forgive me, Your Highness, you're far too kind, Your Highness. This owner is a bully, and he's not a bad person. If he's willing to repent, he wouldn't have been kicked out of Rodu. If he were to be kicked out of Rodu, then his entire family would have to go into exile with him. That's not a good idea." Novin looked at Ike with a benevolent expression, and shook his head as he said, "Mr. Mack set up a stall outside this rotisserie for 5 hours just to change that notice. If Your Highness can get rid of all of the notices on this street, then you'll be able to win the hearts of the people. You're a benevolent teacher, Principal Novin, but Mr. Meg has been humiliated by this bastard. How do you want to deal with him?" Josh nodded before turning to Meg. A hint of elation had just appeared in Ike's eyes, but it was immediately replaced by despair. He was in complete despair just as much as he had just been. That bastard really is annoying. Meg picked up a chair from the side before slamming it directly into Ike's face, creating a dull thump. The chair cracked a few times, and he tossed it aside before turning to Josh with a smile as he said, "But at least I've vented some of my frustrations. Just as Principal Novin said, if Your Highness can get rid of all of the notices on this street, then it'll naturally be more effective than if I were to tear down a restaurant's notice." That chair smack really did feel good. Meg's fingers twitched, and he suddenly felt a sense of relief. Ike, who was lying on the ground dizzily, suddenly had his eyes lit up. Hope was rekindled in his despairing heart. Although his face was still burning with pain, he was still elated. Josh glanced at the cracked chair with a smile, and said, "Mr. Mag, you're a very benevolent person. In that case, I'll make the decision to remove all of the restrictions placed on customers by all of the restaurants on the food street. There will no longer be any aristocratic restaurants. You're the best, Your Highness." The crowd immediately erupted into raucous cheers. This was a victory for the commoners. A smile also appeared on Josh's face. It didn't take him much effort, but he had garnered even more support from the commoners. As for that bastard, he doesn't deserve to be a chef. Even if we don't kick him out of Rodu, from today onward, he doesn't deserve to be a chef in any restaurant, Josh said with a cold expression. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness, thank you." Ike kowtowed. It was already extremely fortunate for him to be able to stay in Rodu. "I only went to the washroom, and it's already quite lively here. Looks like our second prince has done something to be praised again." Right at this moment, a mocking voice sounded as Crassus made his way over to Novin with Amy in tow. He turned to Novin with a smile, and said, "You're here too. Let's go have a drink later." "Master Crassus." Josh extended a respectful salute before turning to Amy with a surprised smile, and said, "So Mr. Meg's daughter is Master Crassus' new disciple. Your acting is a little clumsy, but I'll make do with it. If there's nothing else, I'm going to go have a drink with Mr. Mac and the others with my obedient disciple." Crassus waved a hand as he prepared to leave. Chapter 732. The commotion in front of Carrie's rotisserie gradually died down, and news of the second prince's announcement that all nobles and commoners would be treated equally quickly spread throughout the entire food street. The reason for this was that a legendary chef had set up a small stall and single-handedly defeated Carrie's rotisserie. Countless versions of this story had already been created, and each version was more exciting and thrilling than the last. However, regardless of which version it was, that chef was already viewed as a hero who had fought for the respect and equal treatment of commoners. A restaurant by the name of Mamie began to spread throughout Rhoda's culinary circle. Many customers who couldn't forget about the roast beef began to search for information about this restaurant through various channels. However, no matter how well-versed all of the restaurants in Rhoda were, none of them were able to find out anything about this restaurant, let alone its location. Thankfully, they had heard that the mysterious chef was going to cook for the king the next day, so they should be able to divulge more information. After all, even Duke Abraham was full of praise for this roast beef, so there was no way that it would disappear just like that. The cheers of the commoners also made the owners of the nobles' restaurants feel rather conflicted. Nobles who dared to label their restaurants as off-limits to commoners didn't have to worry about customers. On the other hand, the label of a noble restaurant could attract even more nobles to the restaurant, thereby generating a lot of revenue for the restaurant. However, no one dared to defy the second prince's orders. The head chef of Carrie's rotisserie was the chicken that had been punished to serve as a warning to all of the owners who tried to bluff their way out of this situation. Just who is that guy? He came out of nowhere and caused such a stir. Many people heaved internal sighs as they began to think about how to deal with the displeasure of the nobles. Congratulations, host, you've completed your mission. One stinky tofu recipe has been issued. Within a booth facing the street, the system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. At the same time, a shimmering golden experience bag appeared in Meg's mind. Stinky tofu. It really is a little monster that I both love and hate. Meg fell into deep thought as he looked at the experience bag. Host, I didn't think that you would have such a strong taste, the system grumbled. Meg thought for a while and said, "This is one of the kings of roadside stalls. Its stench dominates the entire street and looks down on everyone. However, it's not suitable for eating in a restaurant." Stinky tofu was known as a dark cuisine. For those who loved it, it was a delicacy. For those who hated it, the smell of it would make them want to avoid it. Such a delicacy with a strong smell was indeed not suitable to be added to a restaurant's menu. That was because even Meg wasn't sure if he could hold on in the kitchen, let alone imagine that the entire dining room would be enveloped by the smell of stinky tofu. It's such a classic dish. It's really a waste if I don't learn it. However, it's not suitable to be sold in restaurants after I learn it. As expected, it's most suitable for roadside stalls. Meg thought in his heart with slight hesitation. It took Meg an entire afternoon to complete the system mission, and at the same time, to promote the banning of the aristocratic restaurants in the Gourmet street. This matter was quite meaningful to him. Father, are you thinking about Big Sister Irina? Amy swung Meg's arm from side to side. Meg came to his senses and turned to Amy. I can see that you've been in a daze ever since I told you that Big Sister Irina had already left. Amy's little face was filled with a knowing expression, and she smiled as she said, "Don't worry, Big Sister Irina said that she'll come to see me again. When that time comes, I'll definitely bring you along. You have to work hard." Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the sight of Amy, who was enthusiastically trying to set him up with Irina. Amy leaned over to Meg's ear and whispered, "Big sister Irina told me to keep an eye on you and not let other women get close to you. This means that she also has feelings for you." Meg's eyelids twitched. He didn't expect such a high-level spy to be so close to him. Then, is Amy going to be bribed just like that? How can that be? I'm on father's side. Amy shook her head resolutely. Meg breathed a sigh of relief. At least the little girl still had a conscience. But big sister Irina is a good girl. Father, you can't let her down. So, I'll still help her keep an eye on father. If any woman comes close to you with bad intentions, I'll burn her with a small fireball. Amy said with a serious face. My biological mother is really different. We've only met for a short while, and she's already successfully turned Amy over. Meg silently complained in his heart. He nodded helplessly and said, "Okay, I'll do as you say." That's great. Amy clapped her little hands with elation. If father could be together with big sister Irina, then it would be a very good thing. When mother came back, they would be able to live happily together. Crassus and Novin had gone out for a while, and both of them returned as soon as all of the dishes had been served. Even though he was curious, Meg didn't ask any questions. However, he had a feeling that Crassus and Novin seemed to be hiding some kind of secret. Dinner brought Meg some joy and surprise. This was the most famous restaurant on the food street. Its signature roast chicken was indeed very delicious, and the other dishes were also quite delicious. Compared to the restaurants in Chaos City, it really wasn't on the same level. Looks like it won't be easy to become the god of cookery on the Norland continent. Meg picked up a crystal-clear pastry with a serious expression. However, at the same time, his heart was filled with confidence. He was the chosen one, and on his path to becoming the god of cookery, he had to succeed or die trying. There was no other path that he could take. However, he definitely wasn't going to die so easily. Novin put down his chopsticks, and turned to Meg with a smile as he asked, "Mr. Mac, is this your first time in Rodu?" Meg hesitated momentarily before nodding with a smile, and replied, "You could say that." "What do you think of Rodu as compared to Chaos City?" Novin asked. Meg pondered seriously for a moment before replying, "Chaos City is a place where the word equality can be found everywhere. However, for the commoners of Rodu, this is only an extravagant hope. Just based on this, I feel that Chaos City is more suitable for me." A gratified smile appeared on Novin's face, and he sighed as he said, "Equality is extremely difficult to achieve. Even Chaos City is far from achieving true equality. There's no such thing as true equality in the human heart. Who can truly be selfless and selfless? However, everyone has their own path, and that's equality." Meg shook his head. Novin's eyes lit up, and he nodded with a smile as he said, "Mr. Mac really is an interesting person." Chapter 733. Are you serious, Principal? Asking a restaurant owner about the power of the world. Meg's eyelids twitched as he looked at the serious Novin. Being stared at by those wise eyes reminded him of being stared at by a primary school principal. After a moment of serious thought, Meg cleared his throat and said, "I think that the power of the world is bound to be divided after a long period of union, and it's bound to be united after a long period of separation. It's not something that an individual can interfere with, and it's not something that a chef like me can predict. It's bound to be divided after a long period of union, and it's bound to be united after a long period of separation." Novin murmured softly before suddenly bursting into laughter. Great. I didn't think that Mr. Mac would be able to see through this better than us old fellows. Division and unification are indeed the power of the world, and it's not something that can be stopped by humans. Looks like this continent is going to be chaotic again. Crassus sighed as he took a sip from his wine glass. He didn't seem to be in a very good mood. Meg looked at the two of them, and didn't say anything else. He had a vague feeling that something big was about to happen. Could it have something to do with the king's birthday banquet tomorrow? Only Amy was happily eating the delicacies in front of her. Her little tummy was so big that it seemed like it could fit an elephant. After dinner, Crassus and Novan left together, while Meg took Amy back to the second prince's residence in a horse-drawn carriage. Along the way, the coachman, who had been knocked unconscious by Irina's chair in the morning, carefully asked Meg what had happened to him today. Meg naturally diverted this matter to the accident caused by Sean, and successfully removed himself from this matter. At the same time, he pushed the blame to Sean. Meg didn't have to worry about whether this would add another grudge between Sean and Josh, who were already on bad terms with each other. What he had to worry about now was going to the palace to cook for the king the next day. Apart from grilled fish, steak, and braised chicken, Meg also prepared the ultimate trump card for the king who loved desserts, ice cream cake. After washing up, Amy lay on the bed with Meg's arm as her pillow. She looked at Meg with her big eyes and whispered, "Father, big sister Irina said today that she knows Mother and that she's the most beautiful elf in the elf tribe. Is that true? How dare you?" Meg rolled his eyes in his mind, but when he saw Amy's expectant gaze, his heart softened. He smiled and nodded as he said gently, "Yes, your mother is the most beautiful elf in the world. She's as beautiful as Irina. Didn't you say you didn't like big sister Irina? Now you've let the cat out of the bag, haven't you?" Amy smiled smugly. Meg was noncommittal and asked with a smile, "Then does Amy like her?" "Yes, of course I do." Amy nodded without hesitation. Then she smiled and said, "When I lay in her arms, I felt like I was lying in my mother's arms. It was so warm. It was completely different from when I lay in the arms of teacher Luna and big sister Yabamiya." Amy had a sweet smile on her face. She closed her eyes and fell asleep with a smile on her face. "Because she's your mother." Meg looked at Amy, who was lying on his arm, and gently kissed her forehead before closing his eyes as well. Amy, this little girl is so sensible and cute, but I've never taken care of a child before. How am I going to get along with her in the future? I heard that there are a lot of kidnappers nowadays. Should I tie her up with a rope? I heard that children are very picky when it comes to food. Will she dislike the food I make? I heard, at the window of an exquisite room, a figure sat on the windowsill, swinging her legs as she muttered to herself. She seemed to be in a dilemma. At the edge of the wind forest, a beautiful elf emerged from the bushes with her hands on her hips. She murmured to herself with a vexed expression, "It's already the 16th day. Did those guys really cancel the deal?" There were some leaves on her body and hair, and her clothes were a little dirty and disheveled. She had 2 dark circles under her eyes, and she looked very fatigued. Tomorrow is the birthday of the king of the Roth Empire. Princess Irina has already gone to Rodu. If they didn't cancel the deal, then it's most likely going to happen in the next 2 days. She looked in the direction of the wind forest, and her expression became resolute again. She turned and disappeared into the dense forest. In the study of the second prince's manor, Josh stood behind his desk with his brows slightly furrowed. Looks like Sean is also suspicious of Meg's identity. That's why he allowed his subordinates to crash into my horse-drawn carriage today. He didn't think that Irina and Crassus would both be in the carriage. Zeus had already returned to Rodu, and he was concealed in the darkness. He said in a hoarse voice, "Your Highness, we still haven't found out who this man is. Could he really be Alex in disguise?" Both the timing and the daughter fit the description too well. Do you think Alex would set up a roast beef stall and sell roast beef for an entire afternoon just to tear down the sign on the door of a roast beef restaurant? Would he be able to make his customers fall in love with his roast beef? He definitely wouldn't do something like that. Meg woke up early the next morning. After helping Amy wash up, the butler knocked on his door. "Mr. Meg, are you ready?" "I'm here to take you to the royal palace," the butler said with a smile. "Us?" Meg was slightly surprised to hear this. He was only a chef, after all, and an important occasion like the king's birthday banquet naturally wouldn't allow a chef to bring his family into the royal palace. He had even considered the possibility of having Amy stay in the second prince's manor alone for a day. The smile on the butler's face became even more respectful as he said, "His Highness said that Master Crassus has already informed him that Amy will be accompanying him to the royal palace as his disciple." The second prince's manor was very close to the Magus Tower, so it was no secret that Amy had defeated Cola as a fifth-tier magic caster. A prodigy like her was destined to become an important figure in the future. "Thank you for your help." Meg was enlightened. With Crassus' status, it wasn't a big deal for him to bring his only disciple to the king's birthday banquet. In the horse-drawn carriage, Amy whispered into Meg's ear, "Father, will we see Big Sister Irina today?" "Most likely." Meg nodded before whispering, "But Amy can't act too familiar with Big Sister Irina in the royal palace." "I know. Big Sister Irina is so beautiful, so there must be a lot of people who want to marry her. If they find out that Father wants to marry her as well, they'll definitely try to get back at Father. I'll pretend that I'm not familiar with Big Sister Irina." Amy nodded obediently. "Good girl." Meg patted Amy's head with a peculiar expression. The horse-drawn carriage drove into the Grand Royal Palace, and after it came to a stop, Meg and Amy drew back the curtain to reveal a human-sized wooden birdman sculpture. What an ugly birdman. I was scared to death. Chapter 734. The wooden birdman that appeared in front of the carriage was sent flying 3 meters away by Amy's kick. It landed with a clang, creating a huge hole in the garden at the side and crushing a patch of chrysanthemums. "Your Highness. Your Highness, are you all right? Hurry and get His Highness out." A large group of people rushed forward and pulled at the bird's head while shouting in a panic. Meg and Amy stared at the birdman that was as tall as a human lying on the ground in a daze. The golden wooden wings carved out of it were very lifelike, and each piece was independent. They even had a metallic luster under the sun. The bird's beak and eyes were also very beautiful, just like a golden rock. The craftsmanship was so exquisite that Meg was a little amazed. If one were to look at it at first glance, it would indeed be a little difficult to distinguish the real from the fake. However, such a huge bird was just standing there without flapping its wings. Furthermore, it was in the palace. It was no wonder that Amy, who had just come out of the carriage, kicked it out instinctively. If it were Meg, he probably wouldn't have been able to resist the kick either. However, Meg raised his eyebrows when he saw the group of panicking guards. "Your Highness. Wooden carving. Could it be that carpenter prince in this wooden carving?" The third prince, who loved wood carving, rarely appeared in Alex's memory. The third prince, who had a noble status, was obsessed with wood carving, and had no interest in fighting for the throne or power. If it wasn't an occasion where he had to appear, he basically wouldn't participate. Many people had even forgotten that there was a third prince in the Roth Empire. This talent is indeed not cut out to be a prince. Meg couldn't help but praise in his heart as he looked at the exquisite wooden carving. "Stop, stop, stop. Which fool is pulling my head? If you continue, it's going to fall off." A somewhat immature voice sounded. The two knights who were grabbing the birdman's head were about to exert force together, but when they heard that, they quickly let go. With a clang, the bird's head fell to the ground again. Ugh, a painful sound came from the bird's head. Your Highness. Everyone panicked, and hurriedly picked up the bird's head again. Forget it. Help me up first, you fools. A helpless voice came from the birdman. The guards hurriedly helped the wooden birdman stand up. Amy's kick wasn't light. A few feathers on the birdman's chest were broken, and some of the feathers on its back were also broken and stained with chrysanthemum juice. It was like a damaged piece of art. It was a pity. Capture them. The leader of the guards waved his hand, and 5 or 6 armed guards surrounded Meg's horse-drawn carriage, preparing to arrest him. The steward who brought Meg and the rest here was a little nervous. He said, "Leader, this is the chef that His Highness the Second Prince invited from Chaos City to cook for His Majesty's birthday celebration. If there's any misunderstanding, please forgive him." The steward who was responsible for bringing Meg and the rest into the palace was naturally not a fool. There were only 3 people in the Roth Empire who could be addressed as His Highness. The first prince and the second prince naturally couldn't be in this wooden carving, so the one who was sent flying by Amy's kick was naturally the third prince. Although the second prince had a high status and was doted on by the king, attacking the third prince in the palace was a crime that could cost him his head. Furthermore, the second prince would definitely draw the line between himself and this matter. When that happened, he might even become an abandoned pawn. This kind of thing was taboo. The leader of the guard stepped forward, and coldly said to that steward, "Do you know who you attacked just now? Even if it's the second prince's people, we have to capture all of them today. Let's see who has the guts to attack His Highness the third prince." This. That steward stuttered, and didn't know how to respond. The leader of the guards waved his hand, and coldly said, "Capture them." All the guards stepped forward with their swords half-drawn. They looked at Meg and Amy warily. To be able to send the third prince, who was wearing a wooden carving robe, flying with a kick, her strength was already comparable to a second-tier knight. I should have checked the almanac before going out today. How could something like this happen? Meg heaved an internal sigh as he shielded Amy behind him. He wondered if he should use Krasu's name as a deterrent, but he didn't know if Krasu's name would be useful in the royal palace. "All of you, idiots. Back off." An angry voice sounded from within the wooden birdman statue. It spread open its wings and patted its belly clumsily like a penguin. It seemed to be trying to press something down, but its wings couldn't reach it. It looked a little silly and adorable. The leader of the guards hesitated momentarily before waving his hand to signal for all of the guards to back off. Meow, Ugly Duckling stared at it for a while before rolling around in Amy's arms with laughter. "Look, father. Even though this birdman is ugly, it's so funny. I feel like it's a little adorable." Amy faltered momentarily before also giggling. Meg's expression was also a little peculiar. This mighty and domineering rock was indeed a little hilarious now. It really is, a little adorable. Even the guards were trying their best to suppress their laughter, and their faces were all red from holding back their laughter. The birdman jumped on the spot, and angrily said, "All of you idiots, what are you looking at? Hurry up and press down that slightly protruding feather on my belly. My wings are crooked, and I can't reach it myself." Ha ha ha, this is so funny. Amy was rocking back and forth with laughter, and almost threw Ugly Duckling out of her hands. Coming. All of the guards hurriedly rushed over and pressed down on the feather in a flurry. They finally pressed down on the feather. Crack. Crack. Following a series of chaotic sounds, a crack appeared in the middle of the birdman's head and body. It then slowly fell to the sides, and a big-headed young man jumped out from within with his hand covering his red nose. "Your Highness, are you all right?" The leader of the guards asked with a concerned expression. You idiot, what could possibly happen to me? It's just a bump on my nose. The young man reached out to push the leader's head away, causing him to bleed. Blood. His Highness is bleeding. Hurry up and call the doctor over. All of the guards were shocked, and began to yell in a flurry. What a bunch of idiots. You won't die from a nosebleed. The young man pulled out a white silk handkerchief from his pocket, and casually rolled it up before stuffing a corner under his nose. He looked at Meg and Amy, who were still in the carriage, with interest in his eyes, and frowned as he said, "You two idiots look so unfamiliar. Is this your first time in the palace?" After that, his gaze descended onto Amy, and he said with a curious expression, "Besides that, you little fool. Even though you're small, your eyesight is really formidable. You actually saw through the ugliness of my wooden carving." Chapter 735. This young man appeared to be around 14 or 15 years old, and there were a few freckles on his nose. His head was close to twice the size of a normal person's head, but his body and limbs were quite thin and frail. At first glance, he really did resemble a large mushroom. Meg tried his best not to burst into laughter. This was none other than the third prince of the Roth Empire, Yuri. Even Alex wouldn't be able to forget his appearance, so Meg had a clear memory of him. He was a little older than he had been 3 years ago, and his head was just as eye-catching. Meg felt like it would be very difficult for him to forget him just by looking at him. There weren't many people in this world who had such a unique appearance. "How dare you? How dare you address the third prince as His Highness?" the leader of the guards yelled with a stern expression. Yuri raised a hand to silence the leader of the guards. There wasn't even a hint of anger on his face as he took a few steps forward. He appraised Amy for a while before asking, "Little mushroom head, do you know Big Sister Irina?" "No way." Meg raised an eyebrow. Things didn't seem to be as simple as they seemed. Amy looked up at Meg before shaking her head. "No, I don't. I think you two look quite alike. Both of you have silver hair and pointy ears." Yuri propped his chin up with one hand as he appraised, and said, "Big Sister Irina once said that if she gave birth to a daughter in the future, she would marry her to me." "No, she didn't. Don't spout nonsense." Before Amy had a chance to say anything, Meg had already interjected with a stern expression. There was already a hint of danger in his eyes as he looked at Yuri. Anyone who tried to lay their hands on Amy, even if it was just a hypothetical young man, was his enemy. If they were in another place, he would have already drawn his sword. Amy and Yuri both turned to Meg in unison. "Father, what's wrong?" Amy asked as she turned to Meg with a perplexed expression. "Are you rejecting me, you big idiot?" Yuri was also perplexed. "Oh, it's nothing. I just think that she might be talking nonsense and not taking it seriously at all." Meg concealed the dangerous look in his eyes. This was the royal palace, after all. However, he was going to keep this in mind. After he reunited with Irina, he had to get her to cancel this messy betrothal between the two of them. Amy was still so young. When it came to marriage, he would not even consider it. He refused to think about it. Otherwise, he wouldn't mind letting the Roth Empire have one less prince. Really? That's great. Yuri's eyes lit up upon hearing this, and he patted his own chest with an elated expression as he said, "This has been my nightmare for so many years. I don't know which idiot would want to marry someone as violent as Big Sister Irina. Her daughter is probably the same as her. If she has forgotten, that would be great. Wood carving is so much fun. I don't want a wife at all." Meg faltered slightly upon hearing this before looking at Yuri with a gratified expression. "It's great that your highness has such thoughts." As expected, hardcore otakus and technical otakus wouldn't have girlfriends. However, this big idiot. Meg's emotions became a little complicated again. Was this a curse? Looks like we'll meet again later. I have to go prepare a new gift for father now. I'm Yuri, big idiot, little idiot. Goodbye. Yuri waved at Meg and Amy before quickly departing. The guard leader glared at Meg. Even though he was unwilling to let the bastard who had beaten and humiliated his master off the hook, he still quickly caught up with him, and anxiously said, "Your Highness, the giant rock is broken. You've prepared it for His Majesty for so long, what are we going to do now? You bunch of idiots. I told you that the giant bird was ugly, and all of you praised it for its beauty. Today, the little idiot finally spoke the truth. Is it appropriate to give father something that gave him such a big fright?" Yuri grumbled with a displeased expression. All of the guards who were carrying the bird statue didn't dare to say anything, but they still had worried expressions on their faces. However, there wasn't the slightest bit of worry on Yuri's face. He smiled and said, "It's too late to prepare a new gift now. Looks like I'll have to bring out that big treasure of mine." The guard leader's expression immediately became nervous, and he whispered, "Your Highness, that thing hasn't been tested yet. If something goes wrong, idiot, what could possibly go wrong? Come with me. I'm going to paint it with paint for the rest of the time." Yuri quickened his pace, and the guards could only jog to keep up. Meg got off the carriage, and looked at Amy with a serious expression. "Amy, don't hit anyone in the palace, do you understand?" Amy wasn't allowed to enter the kitchen, so the steward would take her to the Crassus. Okay. Amy nodded obediently. Good girl. Meg smiled and patted Amy's head. He looked at the steward and said, "Then I'll have to trouble you to take Amy there." Yes. The steward hurriedly nodded as he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He then drove the carriage forward with Amy in tow. The person sitting in the carriage was the devil incarnate who dared to kick the third prince and even gave him a nickname. That kick just now had almost ruined his career and even his life. He couldn't afford to offend him. Meg wasn't worried at all that Amy was with the Crassus. There weren't many people in this world who could hurt Amy right under Crassus' nose, not to mention that he had Novan by his side. Only after the carriage disappeared around the corner did he begin to survey the grand palace before him. It was different from looking at it from afar. After entering the magnificent palace, the feeling of grandeur and magnificence was even more direct. Large, flat stones were used to build palaces. The golden, translucent tiles shone dazzlingly under the sunlight. In front of these palaces, people were as small as ants. Even if one said that this was the palace of a dragon, no one would doubt it. Although Mag was someone who had experienced the baptism of the Forbidden City, he was still awestruck by the most magnificent palace in this alternate world when he saw this magnificent palace that was dozens of meters tall. "Mr. Mag, please come this way." The carriage was filled with all kinds of equipment and marinated ingredients. The coachman had already alighted from the carriage and was holding the reins as he spoke to Meg respectfully. Meg retracted his gaze and looked at the huge house in front of him that also occupied a large area and had the words, "Dining Hall," written on it. He smiled and nodded. Okay. As they walked toward the door, Meg could already vaguely hear the sounds of pots and pans. He could already imagine what a lively scene it would be in this kitchen. On this day, this was going to be a competition between the best chefs on the entire Norland continent. All of the most recognized chefs in the chef's world had already arrived, and whoever could receive the king's approval would become the uncrowned king of the day. Chapter 736. Outside the royal palace, in a dimly lit room, 3 burly figures were seated across from each other. The hottest blood of the orc warriors has already been spilled on the border between our tribe and the Roth Empire. I hope that you demons and forest trolls can show us your true sincerity instead of just paying lip service, the dark green-skinned orc said in a low voice. Don't worry, the most elite warriors of our forest trolls have already arrived at Rodu. I guarantee that Irina won't be able to return alive this time. The forest troll twisted his neck, and a cracking sound rang out. It was as if the sound had been forced out of his lungs. A cold light flashed through the spatial demon's crimson eyes as he sneered, the power structure of this world will be redefined by our alliance. Elves, humans, goblins, these weak and cunning things should obediently become food. They don't deserve to have territory, and they don't deserve to be on equal footing with us. Let them start with internal strife. Meg carried a box of knives as he slowly walked into the massive kitchen. This was the first time that he had seen a kitchen that was almost as large as a football field. There were rows upon rows of neat rows, and there was almost no space left. There were over 1,000 chefs in the kitchen. These 1,000 or so chefs were the most exceptional chefs on the Norland continent. They had gathered here today just to present a delicious dish to the king on his birthday. It's even more spectacular than I imagined. Meg thought to himself as he looked at the demon chef who was slicing through the food like the wind, the forest troll who was holding a wok with his head on fire, and the elven chef who was cooking as elegantly as if he were casting magic. The chefs of different races were displaying one incredible scene after another. All types of wondrous fragrances wafted through the kitchen, and the sounds of pots and spatulas intertwined to form a beautiful melody. It was probably a melody that every chef would love. Mag looked around with great interest. This was the first time he had seen so many people in the same industry using different cooking styles to make delicacies. He was like Granny Lou who had entered the Grand View Garden. There were endless wonders to be seen. Mr. Meg, your cooking position is here. The dishes will be served in 2 hours. I hope you can be ready. The guard who led Meg in stopped and pointed to an empty seat beside him. He looked at Meg and asked, "Are you alone?" Meg put the knife box on the stove and looked at the guard with a puzzled expression. He nodded and said, "Yes, is there anything wrong?" "I'm just a little surprised. Even Kalulu, who only makes one cold dish, has 2 helpers." The guard glanced at the chef beside Meg and said with a smile, "Then, I wish you good luck." Then, he turned around and left. "Thank you." Meg nodded slightly. Along the way, those chefs did seem to have helpers by their side. On the contrary, he was the only one who stood out. "Let's just make a Kalulu cucumber dish." He gave us 3 spots. What's he doing by himself? Could it be that he makes peanuts? Shoo, don't talk nonsense. Peanuts are on the same level as us. The 3 chefs at the nearby stall whispered among themselves. Mag turned his head to look at the chef's seat next to him. A rather chubby man in a white chef suit was smiling at him in a simple and honest manner, and he returned Mag's smile politely. This middle-aged man's body shape was somewhat similar to Dubai's. Even his face shape was completely identical, and he naturally had good looks. There were 2 chubby boys around him who were around 15 or 16 years old. They were all miniature versions of him, and Meg didn't believe that they weren't his sons. The middle-aged man looked at Meg with a curious expression. "Hello, my name is Kalulu. These are Kaklu and Lukaka, and they're my sons." "Brother, what do you do for a living? Why are you by yourself?" The 2 chubby boys also looked at Meg with curious expressions. They were the ones with the least number of chefs here, and they didn't even dare to raise their heads in front of the other chefs. However, this man was by himself, and a sense of superiority welled up in their hearts. Kalulu, Kakulu, Luka. Meg felt as if he was about to faint. These names were really random. He looked at the 3 curious boys with a smile, and said, "I'm Meg. I don't have much to cook, so I don't need any helpers." According to Josh's requirements, he only needed to cook a dish for around 10 people. That was a piece of cake for him, so he didn't need any helpers. I understand. Kalula nodded with a knowing expression. Even though being chosen to cook for the king's birthday banquet was something to be proud of, it was still a little embarrassing for him to only be able to cook a cold dish in front of so many renowned chefs. He could completely empathize with Mag's feelings. It's fine, Brother Mag. Even though we don't have as many people as they do, and the dishes we cook may not be able to be served on the king's table, we have an easy time. Look at that troll over there with a big pot on his head. His head is red from the heat, and the little trolls around him are all circling around him. It's so tiring. Kalula smiled as he explained to Meg. You're right. Meg nodded in confusion. It seemed that the middle-aged man had misunderstood something. However, he didn't have any intention of explaining himself. Instead, he instructed the guards to set up the kitchen utensils. Put this over here, and that over there. Give me the condiments, Father. Does he need that many utensils to cook a cold dish? Why do we only need a basin? Lukaku asked with a perplexed look on his face. He must have moved his entire kitchen here. Although he can only make one cold dish, he still has to pretend that his cold dish is very classy. This is something that we should learn from. I miscalculated. Kalula stroked his chin and said with a resolute expression. A nostalgic look appeared on Kalula's face as he said, Don't talk nonsense. Every chef has their own pride. I can understand Brother Meg's actions very well. Back when I first entered the palace, I even brought a large jar of pickled cucumbers with me. I was worried that others would think that I was just a pickled cucumber. I just wanted to show them that even pickled cucumbers aren't something that just anyone can pickle well. Not everyone has a large jar of pickled cucumbers. Kalula looked at his two sons with a serious expression and said, Look, he's probably at the same stage as I was back then. We have to tolerate him and protect his mentality. We shouldn't mock him. Chapter 737. In the massive cafeteria, the chefs were divided into several levels. Chefs with large bodies and a large number of people would be given several dozen or even over 100 square meters of space. In contrast, chefs like Meg and Kalula, who had very few people, would only be given around a dozen or so square meters of space, which was more like a standard small kitchen. Meg's seat was at the furthest corner. The kitchenware was placed there, and it filled up the space on the stove. Meg glanced at his watch. It was still early, so he didn't rush to start cooking. He didn't really care about the size of his seat as it was just right for him to operate by himself, and it felt as if he were in his own kitchen. Kalula and his son had already made their preparations in advance. Even though they were going to have to serve up a lot of pickled cucumbers, the cucumbers were already pickled, so all they had to do was serve up the dishes, so they weren't in a hurry either. Since he had nothing to do, Mag began to chat with the three kind-looking father and son. The small chef seats were located in the northwestern corner of the cafeteria, and there weren't many people there. When the chefs looked over at them, there was a hint of disdain in their eyes. If there was a chain of disdain for the chefs in the cafeteria, then the chefs with small numbers of chefs were clearly at the bottom of the chain. It was rare for Kalula to find a brother who could empathize with him, so he was very happy to chat with Meg. He was very pleased to be able to converse with Meg as an equal. Brother Meg, look at the largest seat in the northernmost part of the cafeteria. The chef occupying that seat is the #1 chef in the Roth Empire, Bellman. As the #1 chef in the royal palace, he's responsible for the king's daily meals. During this birthday celebration, he'll be responsible for 70% of the food on the king's table, while the remaining 30% will be chosen from the dishes cooked by the other chefs present, Kalula said in a slightly resentful manner. Then will your pickled cucumbers be chosen? Kalula shook his head, and said, "Up until now, there still hasn't been a clear menu, but things like this are like free lunches falling from the sky. There are so many chefs out there, and if one of their dishes is chosen to be on the king's table, they can brag about it for the rest of their lives." Kalula sighed and shook his head. After pausing for a moment, Kalula looked at Meg and comforted him, "But don't be discouraged. You are still young, and the future is yours. Maybe one day, the king will want to eat cold dishes for his birthday, and you will be chosen. If that happens, you will become the best cold dish chef in the entire continent. I haven't learned how to make cold dishes yet." Meg didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he thought to himself. This uncle was really humorous. The two little fatties chimed in from time to time, so it didn't seem boring at all. Cooking was also part of the Jianghu. Bellman was the Wulin Alliance master, and his position was unshakable. Those chefs who had their own signature dishes and knew that they could steadily bring their dishes to the king's table were famous figures in the pugilistic world. Their skills were outstanding. As for those who had their own unique skills and had the opportunity to bring their dishes to the king's table, they were powerful rookies in the pugilistic world. They weren't weak, and they only lacked a bit of luck to reach the top. As for people like Kalulu, they belonged to the group of people who were cheering from below the stage. In any case, no matter what happened on the stage, he was just there to watch the show. It was impossible for the Wulin Alliance master to fall down from the heavens, so he was quite optimistic. "Little Wheat, I really regret not meeting you sooner. If I had known you earlier, I wouldn't have been so bored in the past few years." Kalula patted Meg's shoulder with a gratified expression. "Look at that cucumber slapper, he finally moved a step forward from the last position. But what is that kid doing? He's only one person. Is there a dish simpler than cucumber slapper in this world? Isn't there still peanuts?" Ha ha ha. Just as Mag and Kalula were chatting, a burst of raucous laughter erupted from the nearby stalls, and they weren't trying to hide their laughter at all. Luluka said with an angry expression, "These guys. It's obvious that you're making a cold dish, but you're pretending that you're making something better. That's right, the cold dishes they make aren't as good as father's pickled cucumbers. Isn't it just because they can make one more cold dish that they brought 2 more people?" Luluka also said with indignation. "Alright, don't lower yourself to their level." Kalula waved his hand and looked at Meg as he comforted, "Brother Meg, don't be sad. You're still young. Just make good cold dishes and show them 3 cold dishes in the future. Nandel and Vaser are already old men. They don't have any other skills other than talking to young people." I'm fine." Meg nodded. He felt a warmth in his heart. This fat uncle really was a heartwarming person. Nandel and Vaser's words also drew a lot of attention to Mag. All of the chefs who were invited here were renowned chefs, and this was the first time that he had seen someone cook for the king's birthday banquet alone. However, since he was arranged to sit in the back corner, everyone withdrew their gazes. Even the pickled cucumbers were placed in front of him. What was there to look forward to? This guy who set up all the fancy kitchen utensils on the stove was most likely just here for fun. Meg, who was inexplicably despised, was still calm. He didn't need these guys' approval anyway. A chef's best counterattack was to let food speak for itself. Kalulu was relieved when he saw that Meg's mentality was stable. It wasn't like he hadn't seen a chef's mentality collapse in the past. He looked at the time and said with a smile, "All right, Brother Meg, we're going to start setting up the dishes. You're alone, so remember to watch the time. Don't miss it." "All right, I'm also going to start preparing." Meg nodded with a smile. "Uncle Meg, are you really going to make peanuts? Salty or sweet?" Luluka asked curiously. Meg shook his head with a smile. "I don't make peanuts, but I like salty peanuts." "All right, little brat, Hurry up and set up the dishes. We're going to set up 200 dishes. Kalula patted Leluka's head lightly and urged him. He then carried out a large plate of pickled cucumbers and began to fill it up. Meg looked curiously at the long strips of pickled cucumbers that were placed neatly on the plate. The light golden sauce stained the surface of the cucumbers, and a bit of tender green coriander adorned the edge of the plate. It looked refreshing and delicious. If it were paired with a bowl of porridge, it would definitely be delicious. Meg withdrew his gaze and ordered the waiter standing not far away to start slaughtering the turkey. He then took a knife from the knife rack and began to prepare the various side dishes. The braised chicken needed to be stewed for a long time, so it had to be prepared in advance. Father, look, Uncle Meg isn't making peanuts. He's going to make chicken. Chapter 738. It was year 102 of the Roth Empire's calendar, and this was the 45th birthday of the fourth king, André Edward. Compared to the previous 3 kings, André had been on the throne for a very long time. He had ascended to the throne at the age of 15, and his exceptional governance abilities had made the Roth Empire even more powerful. His unyielding political style had also given the empire an even higher status on the Norland continent. Even the powerful and populous orcs hadn't been able to gain any advantage during the border wars. Instead, they had been forced to give back some of the territory that they had conquered in the past. Even though the empire had sacrificed many of its soldiers' lives for this, it had also received the support of all of its subjects. When the humans on the streets of Rodu saw that the trolls didn't have to bow their heads, the soldiers who had died on the battlefield were all smiling. In the history of the Roth Empire, this was a wise king who was destined to be recorded in the annals of history. In the eyes of the long-lived races, 60 years old was just a tiny baby. However, for the king of the Roth Empire at this age, this was a birthday banquet that was worthy of celebration by the entire empire. There were rumors that the king's body was getting older by the day, and he might not be able to make it to his 70th birthday. As such, this birthday banquet was extremely grand, and the guests invited were all of high status. The palace, which was close to 20 meters tall, was lavishly decorated. All of the guests from the various races were seated on either side of the hall, and there was a small table in front of each of them. The king sat at the head of the table, with grayish-golden hair flowing down his back like a lion's. The fine wrinkles and faint age spots on his face gave him an air of age that didn't match his actual age. However, his brown eyes were still bright and piercing, as if he were a lion king staring at its prey. No one dared to underestimate him, and no one even dared to look him in the eye. On his left and right sat Josh, who was wearing a blue robe, and Sean, who was wearing a lavish golden robe. Further down from them sat Irina and Richard. Richard's expression darkened slightly as he looked at Irina. The fact that Brent had been brutally beaten by Irina had already struck fear into the hearts of all of the magic casters in the Magus Tower, but they had no choice but to swallow their pride. How could Josh not know what Irina was thinking? That child was clearly the real trigger for that incident back then. That child had completely ignited Josh, which was why he did such a crazy thing. Irina was peeling sunflower seeds with a calm expression, and didn't even spare a glance at Richard. She would occasionally glance at Amy, who was happily munching on pastries beside Crassus. Amy was eating like a little squirrel, and she was so adorable. As expected of Irina's baby. As expected, she was just as adorable as I was. Is he really going to cook for the king today? She shouldn't be recognized, right? Irina looked at the door with a hint of worry in her heart. To Irina's birthday banquet's birthday, Irina famous's birthday banquet. In the past, he would have been the first to know that Irina had come to Rodu, but on this occasion, she had bypassed him and gone to the Magus Tower. On top of that, she had brutally beaten Brent and interrogated him about what had happened 3 years ago. It was quite clear that she no longer trusted him, and she most likely knew something. After calming himself down, Josh withdrew his gaze from Irina and turned to Sean. Sean also happened to be looking in his direction, and their eyes met. Both of them nodded with smiles on their faces before averting their gazes in unison. After this birthday banquet, Father will most likely begin to decide on a successor, right? Sean, it's time for us to decide who's the better one. Josh clenched his fists before slowly unclenching them, but he maintained a smile on his face the entire time. After Irina and Richard were the envoys from the various races. In the past, it would have been enough for the ambassadors of the Roth Empire to attend the birthday banquet, but this year, all of the races seemed to have come to a tacit agreement to send their most esteemed representatives to attend the birthday banquet. The only princess of the Elven race, the second elder of the Orc tribal alliance. All of these people were extremely renowned on the Norland continent, and it could be said that they were doing the Roth Empire a great service. Crassus and Novin sat behind the representatives of the various races. As the representative of Chaos City, Principal Novin was also a powerful 10th-tier magic caster, so he was naturally of high status. As for Crassus, seeing as Richard could sit across from Irina, no one would question his right to sit there as well. Earlier, the king had even invited him to sit in the front so that he could be on an equal footing with Richard, but Crassus had refused. It was quite clear that Crassus was no less important than Richard in the king's heart. Further down the row were the dukes, earls, and ministers of the Roth Empire. Many of the guests had brought their family members with them, and the spacious hall was filled with tables and chairs. It was extremely lively. The king raised a hand, and the hall quickly fell silent. He looked at everyone, and a serious expression appeared on his face as he said, "I am very gratified that all of you are able to attend my birthday banquet today. The Roth Empire and all of the other races have coexisted peacefully for the past 100 years. Everyone listened in silence to the most powerful king on the Norland continent. The human race was already powerful enough to stand tall on the Norland continent, and their huge population and intelligent minds gave them unlimited potential. The other races had to admit that the human race had been weak for many years. A powerful magic caster who could jump up and knock a giant dragon on the head with a staff was sitting below. At the very least, no one present dared to say that they could beat him in a head-on battle. As for Amy, she was happily eating the exquisite little pastries on the fruit platter in front of her, and occasionally winked at Irina. "Ha! Teacher Luna is here too. Which one should father choose?" Amy suddenly caught sight of Luna, who was sitting not far away from her, and her hand that was holding the green bean cake instantly faltered. Luna was also looking at her with a smile. This little girl really was a little glutton, she just couldn't stop eating no matter where she was. However, when he thought back to the first time he had seen that little girl in the Aiden Square 2 years ago, who was wearing old clothes and had a slightly dirty face, he suddenly came to a realization. Now, she was sitting in the royal palace of the Roth Empire, wearing a luxurious little purple dress with beautiful braids, and sitting in the royal palace of the Roth Empire. What had happened to Mr. Meg a few months ago? Even as someone who had experienced it firsthand, she was still in disbelief. Mr. Meg is a good person, and Amy is also a good girl. They deserve this, Luna thought to herself, and the smile on her face became even more vibrant. Teacher Luna is so beautiful when she smiles, and she's so nice to me, but big sister Irina is also very nice. What a difficult choice. Amy took a bite of the pastry in her hand, and stuffed the remaining half into Ugly Duckling's mouth with a conflicted expression. The white-haired old man sitting beside Luna looked at Luna with a smile, and asked, "Luna, you said that Mr. Meg will also attend His Majesty's birthday banquet. Where is he now?" Chapter 739. Lukaku's voice was a little shrill. Because he was too surprised, he didn't control his volume well and attracted some unhappy gazes. Everyone's gaze fell on Mag's cooking seat, and they happened to see him receive a freshly slaughtered turkey leg from a waiter. He used a sharp long knife to deftly peel off the skin of the chicken, and then cut it into small diamond-shaped pieces of the same size. In the blink of an eye, the huge drumstick had turned into a pile of chicken meat and a chicken bone that had been cleanly removed. Exquisite knife skills were the foundation of a chef's skill. There were many chefs present who could cut ingredients into thin strands, so they weren't surprised by Meg's knife skills. What really surprised everyone was the drumstick of the turkey. Meg was only one person, and he didn't even have a helper. How could he be qualified to make meat dishes? Nandel, who was busy directing his apprentices, frowned as he looked in Meg's direction. Did this guy send the wrong ingredients? Why did he send such a large chicken leg? Shouldn't he have sent 2 pots of peanuts? Vaser laughed with disdain. Sending the wrong ingredients and cooking indiscriminately will result in being kicked out of the palace. I think he's just making a cold chicken salad. But I've been making cold dishes for decades, and I've never heard of chicken salad. This guy really doesn't care about his life. If that minister isn't satisfied, isn't he afraid of losing his head? When the other chefs heard this, they all laughed, and there was no lack of ridicule. It was like when experts of the Jianghu were fighting on the stage, a guy waving a small flag below the stage suddenly said that he wanted to fight. At this time, the true experts on the stage wouldn't say anything. Instead, it would be the small fries waving flags that would swarm up and drown you with their saliva. Meg was someone who had been baptized by countless curses, and this level of ridicule was not worth mentioning. Kalulu also looked at Meg with some worry. Brother Meg, what are you doing? Can chicken really be used as a cold salad? Salad chicken is also a good dish, but I'm making braised chicken today. Meg smiled and shook his head. He placed the chicken meat into the casserole and stewed it first. Then, he said to the waiter beside him, "Please bring me 10 freshly slaughtered Kirin carps and the beef tenderloin I requested." "All right." The attendant quickly departed. Even though this young man was only by himself, he was a chef appointed by the second prince. Just this fact alone made him worthy of the attendant's attention. In addition to cooking chicken, Uncle Meg is also cooking fish and beef. Luluka looked even more surprised. Although their family's restaurant was famous for its pickled cucumbers, the restaurant didn't only make pickled cucumbers. Every year, when they came to the palace to celebrate the king's birthday, they could only make pickled cucumbers. How is this possible? Nandel looked at Meg with an incredulous expression. He had been cooking at the king's birthday banquet for over 20 years, and it had taken him an entire decade to climb from the first cold dish to the second cold dish. As for the third cold dish, he had already pinned his hopes on his son. However, Meg had come alone, and this was his first time here, yet he was preparing to cook 3 dishes, and all of them were meat dishes. This feeling was akin to someone who had started running decades later than you, but in the blink of an eye, they were far ahead of you, and there was no hope of catching up. Nandel suddenly thought of something, and he sneered, "Humph. You're planning to cook 3 dishes by yourself? Those who are chosen have to make at least 30 servings, and it's impossible for one person to complete all of them. Let's see how you're going to deal with this. I doubt I'll see you again in the future." Kalulu looked at Meg with a worried expression. "Brother Meg, are you sure you can handle 3 dishes by yourself? This is the king's birthday banquet, and it's not something you can mess around with in the restaurant. If you mess this up, you'll lose your head." "It shouldn't be a problem. I'm also cooking alone in the restaurant," Meg replied with a smile. It was only 10 servings, so it wasn't a problem for him at all. Seeing that Meg wasn't in a hurry, Kalulu was slightly relieved. However, he still said, "Then you'd better hurry up. If you need anything, just say the word, and I'll send a boy over to assist you." "Okay." Meg nodded. 10 scaled Kirin carps were delivered to Meg. Meg didn't plan on letting anyone else interfere with the deboning process. The people who had come to attend the banquet today were all of high status. If they were to get a fish bone stuck in their throat, although they wouldn't die, they would most likely find trouble with him. Naturally, it was better to do it himself. Meg removed the fish bones of various sizes from the carps, and the 10 fish were quickly deboned and marinated before being set aside. The fresh beef tenderloin was also sliced into steaks of uniform thickness, and he used a small wooden hammer to soften them. I'm a little reluctant to use such top-notch ingredients for those guys. He took out a bottle of red wine from the box and shook his head. But then, he thought, but Irina and Amy should be able to eat it as well. It's a pity that I didn't hear her praise yesterday. I wonder if she'll say anything today. Pop, a crisp sound rang out as the cork was pulled out of the bottle. The dark red wine was poured onto the plate that held the steaks. The rich aroma of the wine was like a bomb in the deep sea, instantly overwhelming the other fragrances and burrowing into everyone's noses. What a fragrant wine! Could it be that someone used the Buffett Winery's premium wine as an ingredient? No, this aroma is even more fragrant than the Buffett Winery's premium wine. Could it be that they used premium wine? That's simply cheating. The surrounding chefs were in an uproar as they looked around, trying to figure out if this was cheating. Then, their eyes focused on Meg, who was slowly pouring wine from a bottle in the corner, and they were all stunned. This corner was almost equivalent to a cold dish area, so how could someone use wine? Could it be that he was planning to use red wine to make cold dishes? Who on earth is this chef who's alone? What kind of dish is he going to make? These two questions had already become a question in the hearts of many of the surrounding chefs. If it weren't for the fact that they were all so busy with their own work, most of them would have already asked around out of curiosity. Of course, in the hearts of most of the chefs, Meg's method was still just a joke. This was an opportunity that had been carefully selected for, yet he actually treated it in such a way. He might become the most tragic chef in this batch of chefs. Kalula looked at Meg with a worried expression. Using wine to cook dishes, will that really satisfy the king and those ministers? I hope that brother Meg isn't serious. He's really playing with fire. At this moment, Meg was completely immersed in his own world of food. His expression was serious, and his movements were swift and unhurried. He was as elegant as a painter wielding a brush. The braised chicken, the spicy grilled fish, and the black pepper steak were all being prepared in an orderly manner. The chef's dishes had already begun to be placed on the table one after another. In particular, the cold dishes that had been placed on the table earlier were almost all finished. Nandel, Vaser, and their disciples were all looking at Meg with mischievous smiles on their faces. They were even betting on whether or not Meg's dishes would be for the maids, and they didn't bother to hide their mockery at all. Kalulu and his sons had also finished their work, and they were looking at Meg with worried expressions. Mr. Meg, please present your first dish to the king. Chapter 740. Everyone suddenly fell silent. All of the chefs slowly put down their spatulas and kitchen knives as they turned to look at the source of the commotion with incredulity in their eyes. They felt as if they had misheard something. The smiles on Nandel and Vaser's faces instantly stiffened as they looked at the female servant standing in front of Meg's cooking table. Their mouths were wide open, and they felt as if they had been slapped in the face. There was only one chef, and this was his first time cooking at a royal banquet, yet he was going to cook for the king. How could something like this happen? Almost everyone was thinking the same thing, and some of them were even suspecting that the waiter had made a mistake. Father, did I mishear something? I think I misheard as well. Kalulu and his son were also completely dumbstruck, and they were unable to process what was going on. In reality, the waiter was also feeling a little unsure. He had been working at the royal kitchen for over a decade, and this was the first time something like this had happened. He had just confirmed with the commander that this was the chef recommended by the second prince, and that he was going to cook 3 dishes for the king. Only then did he come over. However, seeing as this chef had been recommended by the second prince, he was most likely a decent chef. However, he couldn't tell what was so good about the strange kitchenware on his cooking table, and he didn't even know if the dishes he was going to cook for the king were ready. If something were to go wrong, even he would be implicated. "All right, it's ready. Please wait for a moment." Meg nodded with a calm expression. He turned off the magic stove for the braised chicken before removing the lid of the large clay pot. A cloud of white smoke rose into the air, and the aroma of chicken and shiitake mushrooms intertwined to create a delicious aroma that spread in all directions. If the aroma of countless delicacies in the royal kitchen were to intertwine to form a rich, turbid vortex, then the aroma of this aroma was like a sharp blade. This aura was like a sharp blade that broke through the thick vortex, and it successfully stood out from the crowd of muddy auras, and it brought a completely new experience to everyone. This aroma is so unique. It's so delicious that I can smell it. The waiter's eyes lit up. He had been working at the royal kitchen for over a decade, and there were very few delicacies that could make his eyes light up, and all of them were deeply loved by the king. As expected of the chef recommended by His Highness the Second Prince. His Highness is indeed considerate. As the waiter thought to himself, he felt relieved. With this dish, it wouldn't matter even if Meg's next 2 dishes were ordinary. It smells so good. I want to drink chicken soup. Luluka closed his eyes and took a deep breath, swallowing his saliva. There's no name on the dish, so how do I know who made it? I've tried every dish, and they're just ordinary. They're not particularly delicious, but this definitely isn't something that Alex can make, right? Could it be that he's still planning to make roast beef today? I feel like the roast beef tastes better than these dishes, but it doesn't seem appropriate to serve it on such an occasion. Irina shook her head. She still didn't know if she had already tasted Meg's food, or if his food hadn't been served yet. As one of the 10 dukes of the Roth Empire, Duke Abraham also sat near the front of the table. However, he didn't eat much, either. He put down his chopsticks and shook his head as he murmured to himself, "Bellman's dishes are still delicious, but I don't feel like they're any different from last year's. They're all still the same style and menu, so I'm not really looking forward to it. In comparison, the roast beef cubes I had yesterday gave me a pleasant surprise. I have to bring a few more people to try it tomorrow. 3 cubes aren't enough at all." The king didn't eat much either, and his serious expression struck awe and veneration into the hearts of everyone present. Right at this moment, Sean turned to Josh with a smile, and said, "I heard that His Highness invited a chef to cook for Father's birthday banquet. Is the dish that he's going to present?" His Highness invited a chef to cook for His Majesty. Chapter 741. It's him. Irina's eyes immediately lit up. She looked at the female servants who were making their way over, and her heart was filled with curiosity as to what kind of dish was under the lid. If Meg could only cook roast beef, then she didn't think that he was a qualified chef. She didn't want to eat roast beef every day from now on. Josh smiled and said, "You've asked at the right time, brother. I invited this chef from Chaos City, and he's the best chef I've ever seen. I hope he'll be able to satisfy Father." A small stir immediately ran through the entire palace. No one thought that the second prince would give such high praise to a chef. The best chef. Did Josh really find such a good chef? And it was found in Chaos City. Abraham was a little perplexed. He counted the number of female servants present, and according to their ranking, it didn't appear that he would be able to eat this dish. If this were a normal royal banquet, he would naturally sit at the very front. However, this was the king's birthday banquet, and all of the representatives of the various races were very important, so the 10 dukes could only sit behind Crassus. "Thank you, Josh." The king nodded, but his expression didn't change much. Sean's pupils contracted slightly, but he still wore a smile on his face as he asked, "Does that mean you think this chef's cooking skills are even better than Bellman's, Your Highness?" "If that's the case, I'm really looking forward to the food he's going to cook." Flattery was even more vicious than outright criticism. His brother wasn't a general who only knew how to kill on the battlefield. Josh also wore a smile on his face as he replied, "It's hard to say if he's better than Bellman's, but this chef's dishes give me a very special feeling." "Of course Father's cooking skills are the best," Amy said confidently as she munched on a chicken wing. "Then I'll be looking forward to it." Sean nodded and took a deep look at Josh. "We'll know whether that guy is Alex or not after tasting his dishes." Josh has already seen him, but he still allowed him to enter the palace. What is he trying to do? The conflict between the first prince and the second prince was nothing new in the royal court of the Roth Empire. All of the officials had their own agendas, and even though the ambassadors didn't say anything, all of them were looking at the small trays in the hands of the female servants. The news that King Andrei might choose a successor after his birthday had already spread far and wide. No one knew who would win the king's favor, the first prince, who had a large army and the support of the military, or the second prince, who had the support of the Mage Tower, who had the support of the people. No one knew for sure. In that case, whether or not the two princes could please the king during this birthday banquet might also be a factor that would affect his decision. The dish presented by the chef Joshua had hired might also become a bargaining chip for Joshua. If the king liked it, then it would go in his favor. If the king didn't like it, then the bargaining chip would fall on Sean's side. The entire palace gradually fell silent. Many people craned their necks to look in the king's direction. They all wanted to know what kind of delicacy was hidden on the trays for the second prince to praise it so highly. The servant carried the trays to the king's table with his head lowered. He then removed the lid, and respectfully said, "Your Majesty, this is braised chicken and rice." The other 9 female servants also removed the lids at almost the same time, and placed the braised chicken and rice on the trays onto the nobles' tables. The rich aroma of the chicken and shiitake mushrooms gradually wafted through the air. It was as if a bomb had been dropped into the deep sea, and the fragrant aroma was completely irresistible. A hint of surprise appeared on the king's stern face. He looked at the braised chicken before him, and said with a hint of surprise, "This is..." Irina leaned forward to take a whiff, and her eyes immediately lit up. "It smells so good. This is the aroma of chicken and shiitake mushrooms, but how did the aroma of shiitake mushrooms and chicken become so alluring? This is completely different from the chicken and shiitake mushrooms I've eaten before. Also, this rice is so beautiful, and there's even a little moon in it. Could it be that he really has become a great chef after not seeing him for 3 years? He can actually cook such delicious food. Even the best chef in our clan can't cook shiitake mushrooms and chicken so alluring. No. Looks like he's been coveting my position as the family's chef for a long time, and he's trying to learn how to cook in order to replace me. I definitely can't let something like that happen. He and Amy have to eat my cooking in the future. I can't let my talent in cooking go to waste." All of the representatives of the various races were pleasantly surprised and intoxicated. The food they had tasted today was already enough to make them marvel at the culinary prowess of humans, but just the aroma of this dish was already enough to fill them with anticipation. The aroma quickly spread through the palace, and the rich aroma made all of the nobles who hadn't had a chance to taste it gulp as they exclaimed in admiration. "This aroma is simply amazing. Shiitake mushrooms are rare, but who would have thought that cooking them together with chicken would create such a beautiful and alluring aroma? What a genius!" Abraham was stunned, and he craned his neck to look at the braised chicken and rice on Crassus' table. I can't believe I didn't get a share. This is outrageous. Sean's hands clenched into tight fists before slowly unclenching. He had met this chef the day before, and his cooking skills seemed to have exceeded his expectations. If Josh really did manage to win the favor of his father, then it would definitely be bad news for him. Josh took a glance at Sean, and the smile on his face widened. The chef said that the chicken soup would taste even better if it was poured into the rice, the attendant said in a respectful manner before leaving the palace with all of the female servants. The king picked up his chopsticks and looked at the golden chicken in his bowl, which was completely flawless. The potatoes were cooked but didn't fall apart, and the lettuce was still as green as ever. There were also red and green peppers in the bowl, and the golden broth was not greasy in the slightest. The rich aroma of chicken and shiitake mushrooms wafted toward him, and his appetite was instantly roused. He picked up a piece of chicken with his chopsticks, and his wrinkled face seemed to have lit up in an instant. The delicious broth wrapped around the chicken was exuding a delectable flavor, and it was as if Andre's taste buds had been reawakened. It was like a grassland that had been bathed in spring rain, and it was rejuvenated. Biting open the tender chicken, it was smooth and chewy. The taste of seasoning and shiitake mushrooms had perfectly penetrated into the chicken, making it particularly delicious. After swallowing, the fragrance lingered in his mouth and teeth, and the endless aftertaste made him close his eyes involuntarily. He didn't know when it started, but he didn't find eating interesting anymore. Every day, he would just eat the nutritious food that the royal chef had already prepared for him. Even Bellman's dishes didn't give him any pleasant surprises at all. However, this braised chicken had brought him joy and joy. After swallowing the chicken, he picked up a piece of shiitake mushroom and put it into his mouth. He was completely immersed in the delicious aroma of the chicken, and there was no need for words to praise him. He was completely immersed in the taste. Everyone looked at the king, who had barely touched his chopsticks the entire time, and there was already a slight commotion among them as he continued to eat the braised chicken and rice. Let me see just how delicious this is. Irina also picked up a piece of chicken with her chopsticks. After eating this chicken, big sister Irina will probably fall in love with father. Chapter 742. This flavor, it's indescribable. Irina didn't know how to describe this feeling with words. This was an extreme experience brought about by a delicacy that she had never tasted before. The wonderful taste and smooth texture made her feel as if she could feel the vitality of the fire chicken. The most unique flavor was the shiitake mushroom. This type of delicious mushroom was only occasionally found in the wind forest, but after being dried in the sun, it tasted so delicious. After swallowing the chicken, Irina picked up a spoon and poured a spoonful of broth onto the rice. The moonlight rice absorbed the light golden broth, and the small crescents in the rice grains turned a golden red. She scooped a spoonful of broth into her mouth. The soft rice absorbed the rich chicken broth, and the sweetness of the rice became more and more fragrant as she chewed. It was an extremely delicious experience. What has he been doing for the past 3 years? That man can even roast sweet potatoes into charcoal. How can he cook such delicious food? This is... Irina stared at the braised chicken and rice in front of her with an incredulous expression, but a hint of danger suddenly appeared on her face. Could it be that he doesn't like the food I cook? Is that why he's working so hard to learn how to cook? Is it so that he can one day take over my cooking position? No, I definitely can't waste my talent so easily. Irina shook her head slightly and ate another piece of shiitake mushroom. A blissful and joyful smile appeared on her face, and she couldn't help but praise in her heart, but it really is delicious. In that case, I'll force myself to let him cook 1 meal a day from now on, and I'll still have to cook for the remaining 2 meals. Irina nodded with a determined expression. She looked up at Amy, who had her hair tied up in a beautiful ponytail, and thought to herself curiously, it's been 3 years since we last met, and it looks like I have to get to know him all over again. Cooking, tying up hair. What else has he learned? The forest troll, who was still 3 meters tall, held a bowl that was about the size of his finger, and ate the entire bowl of braised chicken and rice in one gulp. He smacked his lips and praised, "This chicken is so delicious. The chef recommended by His Highness is indeed very good, but the portion seems to be a little small." The goblin representative took a small bite of the chicken, and glanced at the forest troll with a mocking look. "You're eating such delicious food in one gulp. What a waste. Even women don't eat like you. Can you taste it?" The forest troll retorted. The feud between the two tribes had been building for a long time, and the border war was just as fierce as the war between the orcs and the Roth Empire. After all, they were in the Roth Empire's royal palace, and it was the king's birthday celebration. Both parties were rather restrained, and didn't get into a fight. All of the representatives were clearly very satisfied with the taste of the braised chicken and rice, and they couldn't stop praising it. When the ministers smelled the fragrance, they all chimed in one after another. If this was just an ordinary dish, it wouldn't be worthy of so much praise, no matter how delicious it was. However, Josh had hired this chef, so rather than praising the dish, they were praising Josh's filial piety and discerning eye. "Is it really that good? I can only smell and look at it, but I can't eat it. This is torture." Duke Abraham couldn't sit still any longer. He swallowed his saliva as he looked at the dish. All he could think about was how he could get some food, but even he didn't dare to do anything in this situation. "Is it really that good?" Sean's expression darkened at the sight of all the praises. He hesitated momentarily before picking up a piece of chicken and putting it into his mouth. Sean's expression became a little complex, but his mouth was still chewing with gusto. This wasn't just delicious, it was delicious to the extreme. The tender chicken had absorbed the fragrance of the shiitake mushrooms, and it was so delicious that he almost chewed on his own tongue. In comparison, Bellman's cooking really was quite mediocre. Looks like he really isn't Alex. He doesn't know how to cook, and there's no way he could be a chef and come to Rodu to cook for Father's birthday banquet. Sean put down his chopsticks and looked up at Josh. His younger brother was no pushover. If he really was Alex, he would most likely be the first person to want to kill him. However, he might not be Alex's daughter, but what about her? Could she be Alex's daughter? She was a half-elf of similar age, and she was also a magic prodigy with silver hair and blue eyes. Wasn't this all a little too much of a coincidence? If Alex, who had already become a cripple, had entrusted his child to someone else, then it wouldn't be that hard to understand. After all, he was a cripple who couldn't even take care of himself, so it was no different from killing a newborn child. If she really is Alex's daughter, then perhaps I can get some information about Alex from that chef, regardless of whether he's dead or alive. Sean withdrew his gaze. Finding Alex would be a fatal blow to Josh. No one would support a prince who had murdered Alex to become the new ruler of the empire, as Alex was the hero of the Roth Empire, a true hero of the entire empire. Even though the king had already tacitly agreed to this, Sean wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by. There was only one throne, and he was going to do whatever it took to secure it. He had to find Alex before Josh did, and force him to tell him who was the mastermind behind all of this. Of course, if it weren't for the fact that Josh had been blinded by jealousy, he wouldn't have done something as stupid as leaving Alex alive. As expected, one really couldn't treat a woman with sincerity. Chapter 743. Congratulations, Master Meg. His Majesty and all of the nobles are full of praise for your cooking. You have a very good chance of winning the Best Dish award. Right at this moment, the same server from before walked in with the 10 female servants, and even before reaching Meg, he was already very excited. The entire royal kitchen seemed to have fallen silent as astonishment appeared on the faces of all of the chefs present. Arg! The tree man pulled his hand out of the stove, which was on fire, and stuffed it into the water tank beside him with a hint of lingering fear in his eyes. What did it mean to win the Best Dish award? That award meant that one would become the #1 chef in the entire royal kitchen. In a sense, it could be said that one had reached the pinnacle of the cooking world on the Norland continent. In the past, the Best Dish award had almost always been won by Master Bellman. Even if there were some exceptions, the winners would always be the royal chefs of the royal palace. All of them were top-notch chefs in the world of chefs, and were highly respected and well-respected. Even though the Best Dish award didn't completely represent one's ability, it was still a very prestigious award. Being able to stand out among so many top-notch chefs and earn the king's favor naturally meant that one's future was limitless. However, this server was saying that Meg had a very good chance of winning this award, which had always been won by the master chefs. If this server wasn't exaggerating, then wouldn't Meg be the biggest dark horse of this year's royal kitchen? How could this be? Nandel and Vaser's expressions both changed drastically. They had thought that Meg was only a third-rate chef, but who would have thought that even the king was praising him over and over again, and that there was a very good chance that he could win the Best Dish award. Thinking back to what they had just said, they wanted nothing more than to dig a hole and hide in it. What was even more terrifying to them was that if Meg were to become a master chef like Bellman in the future, would they be disqualified from the royal kitchen? They had made a lot of money during the past few years due to their reputation as royal chefs, and all they wanted was for their disciples to continue to make money. However, the tables had suddenly turned, and it seemed that they had offended someone that they couldn't afford to offend, and they were suddenly struck by a sense of panic. Uncle Meg is so awesome. Luluka and Lukaka looked at Meg with admiration. Their eyes were filled with stars. Kalula blinked his eyes in disbelief. What's wrong with this world? Why is something like this happening to me? You flatter me. Please wait for a moment. The second dish will be ready soon. Meg nodded slightly. He was neither surprised nor happy. He was still as calm as ever. He didn't think that he would be able to secure victory with just a single dish. After all of the best chefs on the entire Norland continent had gathered here. Perhaps his unique taste buds would be a refreshing experience, but that wasn't enough to crush all of the other chefs. He had to give it his all for the next 2 dishes. After all, he had come to Rodu to complete the system mission, and if he failed, he wouldn't be able to bear the consequences. As for the super reward that the system mentioned after the completion of the mission, he was also quite curious. After all, the system had always been stingy. Could it be that it would give him a big gift package? All right. The attendant nodded and stood off to the side without any intention of rushing him. Meg's prowess had already won him over, and barring any mishaps, the royal kitchen was going to welcome another permanent chef. Furthermore, he was going to be one of the most beloved chefs in the empire. In the northwestern corner of the royal kitchen, a middle-aged chef glanced in Meg's direction with a slightly displeased expression on his face. Bellman was wearing a black and white chef suit with his gray hair combed back, and a tall white hat on his head. Master, that chef from Chaos City, he's the one being praised, so why are you getting all worked up over him? Bellman scooped a spoonful of soup into his bowl before sprinkling some chopped green onions and condiments into it. The chef was a little anxious as he said, but he's just a chef from Chaos City. Even Beat is revered as the #1 chef in Chaos City. How can he compete with you for the best dish at the royal banquet? I refuse to accept this. Exactly. He's only been a chef for a few years. How can he compare with you, master? I think that attendant is just making things up. His Majesty loves master's dishes the most. How could he possibly like that guy's dishes? All of the other chefs chimed in with indignant expressions. In their eyes, Meg didn't even have the right to challenge Bellman, so how could he compete with him for the best dish at the royal banquet? If he really can cook dishes that satisfy His Majesty, then that would be a cause for celebration. Bellman put down the spoon in his hand and looked at the chefs beside him with a serious expression as he said, "I've told all of you on more than one occasion that there is no end to cooking. If you want to become a true chef, you have to constantly learn and improve, and you have to constantly innovate. I'm not the height at which all of you can stop, I'm just a stepping stone for all of you. Only then will more delicious and interesting dishes be created." All of the chefs fell silent upon hearing this. Even though they were still a little indignant toward Meg, they had also begun to reconsider Bellman's words. The steak sizzled as it was cooked on the hot iron plate, and the aroma of the steak that had been soaked in red wine and all types of condiments quickly wafted through the air. Black pepper sauce was poured over the medium-well steak, and 2 broccoli flowers and peppers were garnished on top of it. One after another, the black pepper steaks were quickly carried away by the graceful female servants. Nandel and Vaser had already shut their mouths. If it weren't for the fact that they had gone too far with their words, they would have already started to suck up to Tang Wulin. Calulo also made his way over to Meg with a smile on his face as he said, "Brother Meg, I didn't think that your cooking skills would be so impressive. That steak just now looked extremely delicious. You really are a man of hidden talents. If you can become the best dish at the royal banquet, then you'll really become famous overnight. You're far too kind, big brother. I only performed as per normal, I can't afford to become the best dish." Meg shook his head with a smile. He couldn't help but feel like the adjective, overnight fame, applied to him was a little strange. Within the palace, the king put down his spoon. He had already finished his braised chicken and rice, and there wasn't even a single grain of rice left. The delectable taste of the braised chicken and rice, as well as the rich nutrition of the chicken soup, had made his complexion slightly rosy, and he was still craving for more. All of the other representatives wore similar expressions on their faces. They didn't think that this was going to be an ordinary banquet, but their appetites had been piqued by such a small dish. If it weren't for the fact that they felt that it was inappropriate, they would have already ordered more. His Highness the Second Chef presents his second dish. Chapter 744. The braised chicken and rice was already a pleasant surprise to everyone, and at the same time, it also raised everyone's expectations. If the chef were to only present a single dish, then the braised chicken and rice would definitely be an unforgettable dish. However, the customers would always have higher expectations and more requirements for the same chef. Therefore, whether the second dish would be a surprise or an ordinary one had already become a matter of curiosity in the hearts of the people present. Judging from the king's reaction after finishing the entire braised chicken and rice, it was clear that he was very pleased with the chef that the second prince had hired. This was clearly a very beneficial thing for the second prince. This dish is called the black pepper steak. Chef Meg said that this dish should be sliced with a knife and fork before dipping into the sauce. The attendant carried the steak over to the king in a respectful manner before removing the lid, and the aroma of the steak and wine quickly swept through the entire hall like a tornado. The king's eyes lit up slightly. He didn't have any other hobbies, but he just couldn't live without the small things in his cup, and wine was his favorite. Even though it wasn't to the point of addiction, it had already become a habit for him to fall asleep without drinking a glass of wine every night. The aroma of the wine wafting from the steak was not inferior in the slightest to that of the premium wine that he had ordered from the Buffett winery. Perhaps it was because the steak had been cooked together with the steak, but the aroma of the wine seemed to be even richer than that of his wine. His stomach, which was already somewhat full, started to squirm uncontrollably. He raised his hand and the maid beside him quickly walked over. She picked up the knife and fork and carefully cut the steak into small pieces that were just enough to eat. Abraham took a deep breath, and an intoxicated look appeared on his face as he said, "What an intoxicating aroma of wine. After combining it with the steak, it doesn't feel out of place at all. In fact, it even makes me feel a little intoxicated. Your Highness, you've picked up a treasure." Abraham's eyes were fixed on the steak in front of Josh, and his salivating smile was quite obvious. Josh only hesitated momentarily before turning to the female servant with a smile, and said, "Duke Abraham has always been a foodie, and Josh is pretty much done eating already. Bring this black pepper steak to the Duke." "Really?" Abraham's eyes immediately lit up. "Of course." Josh nodded with a smile. The maid respectfully picked up the steak, walked to Abraham, and put it down respectfully. "Thank you, Second Prince." Abraham expressed his gratitude before sitting down and taking a deep sniff. The aroma of the beef was enhanced by the wine, and there was a unique aroma that elevated the aroma to a whole new level. It was the aroma of black pepper. As a veteran foodie, he was naturally no stranger to black pepper. Perhaps it was because this spice was too expensive. Until now, he had never seen a chef who used black pepper to amaze him. They only used black pepper in cooking to bring some special fragrance to the food. However, at this moment, he found this feeling. After the unique aroma of the black pepper blended with the aroma of the beef, it was so harmonious and alluring. It was as if everything was supposed to be like this, and it was so natural that it was hard to extricate oneself from it. "This is simply a genius idea." Abraham couldn't help but praise as he picked up his knife and fork without any hesitation. He carefully sliced off a small piece of beef as if it were a work of art before placing it into his mouth. The beef was even more tender than he had imagined, and as soon as he bit into it, the juices of the meat and red wine flowed out before combining with the black pepper sauce in his mouth. It was as if a magic caster had cast an explosive spell in his mouth, and his calm taste buds were in ecstasy. The rich layers of flavors made him feel as if he were constantly spinning on a delicious roulette, and every second was a wonderful and unique experience. After swallowing, he felt as if a ball of warmth had flowed down his throat, and even his stomach had become warm. It was so comfortable that he almost wanted to moan. What a wonderful taste, a warm and wonderful experience. It's simply irresistible. Is this chef the devil? Abraham sliced off a second piece of beef before placing it into his mouth, and he closed his eyes to carefully savor this wonderful experience. This was the most amazing and delicious food he had tasted during this banquet. The roast beef from the day before was also delicious, but compared to this steak, it was more suitable to be eaten at street stalls. In contrast, sitting in this lavish palace and eating a black pepper steak with a knife and fork was a very elegant and graceful sight to behold. Irina appraised the steak before her, and asked, "Aside from roast beef, does he know how to cook beef like this? Let me try and see how this steak tastes compared to yesterday's roast beef." Irina sliced off a small piece of beef and put it into her mouth. Her eyes lit up at first, then slowly curved into small crescent moons. A joyful smile appeared on her face, and after swallowing, she even stuck out her pink tongue to lick her lips. As expected of my man, no matter what he cooks, he's always so good at it. It tastes completely different from roast beef, but it's just as delicious. Irina opened her eyes, and an indescribably sweet feeling welled up in her heart. She then sliced off another piece of beef and placed it into her mouth before chewing happily. The smile on her face had Josh completely entranced. Sigh, as expected, no one can resist father's charm after tasting his cooking. Amy looked at Irina and shook her head before turning her gaze to Josh. She then followed his gaze back to Irina, and her brows furrowed as she murmured, "Could it be that this little white mouse is lusting after my beautiful big sister Irina? No. She belongs to father. I'll keep an eye on you. Where did the second prince find this chef? His culinary skills are so good that even His Majesty is so pleased with him. Indeed, this is more pleasing to His Majesty than any other gift. The second prince is truly very thoughtful. The officials who were familiar with each other were discussing quietly among themselves. Josh had clearly achieved his goal with this dish offering. Luna, could this chef be the Mr. Meg that you were talking about? The elderly man sitting beside Luna asked with a surprised expression. According to Luna, Mr. Meg had only come to Rodu at the invitation of the second prince. However, a prodigy with astonishing aptitude for mathematics was also an astonishingly talented chef. Yes, grandfather. He is Mr. Meg. His main job is as an exceptional chef and restaurant owner, and mathematics is his hobby. Byron Field faltered slightly upon hearing this before sighing with emotion as he said, he's able to reach heights that others would never be able to reach with just his hobby. I'm looking forward to meeting this young man more and more. Indeed, he's a prodigy. Luna nodded as a hint of reverence appeared in her eyes at the thought of that gentle and talented man. This one is for His Majesty, these two are for the first prince and second prince, this one is for the elven princess, this one is for Master Crassus, and the rest are for all of our esteemed guests. They all have different tastes, so make sure you don't mix them up. Meg issued a serious reminder to the servants before looking on with a sweet smile on his face. Chapter 745. The braised chicken and rice and black pepper steak struck quite a blow to the hearts of the guests who couldn't eat the dishes. They could only look at the dishes but not eat them, and they had to endure all kinds of compliments and reactions, which was driving them crazy. When the king swallowed the final piece of beef and revealed a satisfied smile, everyone thought that everything was over. In the end, the chef invited by His Highness presents the third dish. A demonic voice rang out from the entrance of the palace, and 2 rows of female servants strode in from the entrance. Each of them was holding a long platter that was twice the size of the previous 2. There's more. The king was also rather surprised. He had already eaten more than his usual appetite for the braised chicken and rice and black pepper steak, and it could be said that the chef had indeed given him a craving for food. The fact that a chef could cook 2 such delicious dishes was already a testament to his abilities, and Josh had indeed put in a lot of effort. He didn't think that there would be a third dish after eating 2 dishes. Even though he was already feeling a little full, he was still looking forward to it. Putting aside whether he could eat it or not, the third dish on the platter really did pique his curiosity. The food was delicious, but Sean couldn't bring himself to eat it, and he was feeling rather depressed. Was Josh going to stop this? He was beginning to regret not killing Meg the day before. Even though that would have worsened his relationship with Josh, it would have saved him some trouble. On the contrary, Josh was in such a good mood that he wanted to sing at the top of his lungs. However, he had to control his expression and emotions in the palace, so he couldn't display too much joy. Your Majesty, this dish is spicy grilled fish. Please enjoy. The servant opened the platter, and a grilled fish covered in red chili peppers appeared before everyone's eyes. A slightly spicy aroma wafted toward the king, and his brows furrowed slightly. However, to his surprise, the spicy aroma of the red chili peppers wasn't as pungent as he had imagined. Instead, it was more fragrant and spicy, and the aroma was even more pronounced than the spicy aroma. The spicy aroma stimulated his already satiated stomach, and he was struck by the urge to pick up his chopsticks again. Under the chili was a whole fish. The skin of the fish was slightly yellowish. Under the crisscrossing knife, one could see the plump flesh of the fish that had been dyed red by the gravy. It was the kind of feeling that made one want to eat it. A faint smile appeared on Josh's face at the sight of the king's expression. It seemed that his father had also approved of the dish that he was most worried about. During this banquet, his father had almost only eaten the dishes cooked by Meg, so the best dish of the day was definitely going to be Meg's, which was good news for him. The maids lifted the lids on the trays before carefully placing the grilled fish onto the table. The strong spicy aroma wafted through the air like a pepper bomb. "What is this?" Sean subconsciously leaned back. The hot spicy smell that assaulted his face stung his eyes. That kind of spicy smell was almost tangible. Just a whiff of it made his throat itch a little. Josh sat in front of the 4 portions of insanely spicy grilled fish, and smiled as he said, "There's no need to be so alarmed, Brother King. This is a spicy grilled fish, and it's renowned for its spiciness. It smells spicy, but it's extremely spicy when you eat it." He had thought that Meg had reduced the amount of chili, but from the smell of the grilled fish, it seemed to be even more spicy than the last time. But what could he do? Meg was his chef, so no matter how spicy the food was, all he could do was sit there and smile as if he were enjoying it. It was so fragrant that he was on the verge of tears. Josh took a glance at the calm king, and heaved an internal sigh of relief. At the same time, he couldn't help but praise internally, "I didn't think that father would be so fond of chili. It looks like he has guessed father's taste buds. That's a huge contribution." The spiciness of the grilled fish had already exceeded the tolerance range of the average person, and Sean was just about to complain when he saw that the king had already picked up his chopsticks, and he swallowed the rest of his words. "This grilled fish is so spicy, but it's so fragrant. Indeed, this fish is a little small, but it should taste quite good. It's just that I don't really like to eat small fish, the fish bones are too small." All of the representatives looked at the spicy grilled fish before them with some hesitation, but at the same time, they also wanted to try it. The previous 2 dishes had given them a very high expectation for the 3rd dish. However, the fiery red chili and the strong spicy aroma had become an obstacle for them to move their chopsticks. For a moment, no one moved their chopsticks. "Is it really that spicy? Why do I feel like my grilled fish is very fragrant, and it's not that spicy?" Irina took a deep whiff of the grilled fish in front of her before looking at everyone with a perplexed expression. Then, she murmured to herself, "I didn't think that he would even know how to grill fish. Is there anything that he can't cook, be it flying in the sky, swimming in the water, or running on the ground? This really is a huge threat to my position." Just as everyone was hesitating about whether they should eat the grilled fish, the king had already picked up his chopsticks and placed a piece of fish into his mouth. His lips moved slightly, and a faint smile appeared on his face. The fine wrinkles on his face slowly disappeared like ripples. This was a joyous smile that came from the bottom of his heart, and it was the best compliment he could give to the dish. After swallowing the piece of fish, the king turned to everyone and nodded as he said, "This is a very delicious piece of fish. You should all have a taste." "Yes, father." Josh immediately picked up his chopsticks and picked up a large piece of fish. The red gravy had already stained the meat of the fish red, and a strong spicy aroma wafted toward his nose. He forcibly resisted the urge to back away as he placed the piece of fish into his mouth. In the blink of an eye, Josh felt as if his mouth and tongue had already gone numb. His face instantly turned red, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. He had already experienced this feeling once the day before yesterday, but this time, the feeling was obviously more intense. His tongue and mouth were completely numb, and the strong spicy taste rushed straight to his brain, causing his mind to almost go blank. Tears were already swirling in his slightly red eyes, but he just had to forcefully endure and not let himself cry out. "I just need to hold on for a little while longer." Josh clenched his fists as he prayed in his heart. The numbness and blankness persisted for a while before finally subsiding. What followed was the extreme deliciousness of the tender and delicious fish, which slightly overshadowed the spicy sensation. In that instant, all he could taste was the delicious flavor of the fish. One mouthful of fish after another, only the deliciousness of the dish could completely overwhelm the spiciness. Josh's face was as red as if he had just come out of a furnace, and his forehead and body were already drenched in sweat. This feeling really was unbearable. Sean took a glance at Josh, who was enjoying his meal. His father had already spoken, so he could only grit his teeth and pick up a piece of fish before putting it into his mouth with some difficulty. Sean's face almost instantly turned the color of pig's liver. He had already lost all feeling in his tongue and mouth, and in that instant, he almost wanted to spit out the fish. However, he could see that Josh was enjoying his meal across from him, and he forcibly repressed that urge. His hands were tightly clenched into fists under the table. This level of spiciness was not something that a normal person could handle. However, in a situation like this, if he were to do something inappropriate, then all of his previous efforts would be for naught. His father would never allow a disgraced prince to become the king. Chapter 746. Sean had experienced countless life and death battles on the battlefield and crawled out from piles of corpses. Compared to Josh, who had never left Rodu, he had sacrificed a lot for the throne. As someone who didn't like spicy food, he was almost about to faint in the face of such terrifying spiciness. He clenched his fists so tightly that his fingernails dug deeply into his flesh. His eyes had also turned red, but he could only repress the urge to cry out. Was this level of spiciness really something that humans could tolerate? Why was father able to enjoy it so much? Or did Josh get that chef to add more spicy food to mess with him? Countless questions flashed through Sean's mind, and he was struck by a murderous urge. Just as he thought that this spiciness was going to last for a long time, the numbness in his lips and tongue began to dissipate, and the delectable taste of the fish began to soothe his numb mouth. The crispy fish skin, the tender fish meat, and there wasn't even a single bone in the fish. The deliciousness hidden within the spiciness was so incredible that it had broken through the blockade of the spiciness and struck directly at his soul. It was as if rain had suddenly descended upon a desert that had been parched for thousands of years. This was an indescribable feeling, but it also successfully suppressed the spiciness. His throat moved a little, and he swallowed the fish. The fish meat was like scorching lava that had just been scooped out of an active volcano. The spiciness slowly slid down his throat, and it was as if a ball of fire had been ignited within his body. The twisting and convulsing of his stomach made him feel rather uncomfortable, and the spiciness in his mouth gradually returned, as if there were countless tiny ants gnawing on his flesh. His rationality told him that it was best not to touch the fish again, but he couldn't help but pick up a second piece of fish meat with his chopsticks and place it into his mouth. The delicious fish meat successfully suppressed the spiciness, but what followed was an even more spicy experience, and this feeling could only be suppressed by eating another piece of fish meat. Sean suddenly understood what Josh meant when he said that he couldn't stop eating the spiciness. He couldn't stop even if he wanted to. However, Josh didn't seem to be doing much better than him. His face was flushed, and he was sweating profusely, but he was also unable to stop eating. Looks like the two princes can't stop eating. Is this spicy grilled fish really that delicious? Indeed. The two princes really are true people to be so immersed in delicious food. When the ministers saw this scene, they were all surprised. The two princes had always been very cautious in front of others. Who would have thought that they would be eating in such an unpretentious manner in the palace? In fact, they even appeared to be in a slightly disheveled state. This was quite surprising, and it was clear that the spicy grilled fish was extremely delicious. Who? The forest troll representative opened his mouth and spat out a ball of flame, which landed on his leg and set it ablaze. Fortunately, Richard, who was sitting to the side, had quick reflexes and raised his hand to extinguish the fire with a water ball spell. This small fish is really delicious, but the spiciness is really not simple. Even I have learned how to breathe fire. The forest troll put down the bowl in its hand with lingering fear. Only the main bone of the grilled fish was left, and its originally withered yellow body had turned dark red. It was a rather comical sight. It's indeed very delicious, especially this hot and spicy feeling. It's really awesome. The abyssal demon's skin was also covered with a layer of faint red, and it wore an excited expression as it ate mouthful after mouthful of fish. Looks like aside from the spiciness, it's pretty good. Irina nodded in agreement. She picked up a piece of fish with her chopsticks and dipped it in the red broth. She blew on it before carefully placing it into her mouth. The spicy broth made the tip of her tongue and lips feel slightly numb. This was a very special feeling, as if someone had suddenly pinched the tip of her tongue, causing her to temporarily lose some of her senses. Immediately thereafter, the delicious flavor of the fish began to wreak havoc in her mouth and on the tip of her tongue. The crispy skin of the fish was crispy but not charred, and the flesh beneath the skin was extraordinarily tender and bouncy. The fragrant and spicy broth soaked through the flesh of the fish, and the spicy and tangy texture whetted her appetite. After swallowing the fish, she felt as if a ball of warm fire was slowly flowing down her throat into her body, warming her stomach and body, giving her a sense of comfort and enjoyment. Vivian didn't really like eating fish as she always had no way to deal with the small fish bones, and the feeling of having something stuck in her throat was very uncomfortable. However, to her surprise, there were no small fish bones in that piece of fish, only fresh and tender flesh. Is it a fish without any fish bones? Irina's eyes lit up as she picked up another piece of fish and placed it into her mouth. The fish melted almost immediately in her mouth, and there were also no small fish bones. Instead, there was only a fragrant and spicy texture. It's a little numb and spicy, but it's not as bad as what they're saying, is it? Could it be that I actually have a talent for eating spicy food? Irina took a peculiar glance at Josh and Sean before placing another piece of fish into her mouth. Her eyes narrowed slightly as a blissful smile appeared on her face. But this grilled fish really is delicious. The spicy texture paired with the fresh and tender flesh of the fish doesn't feel greasy at all. No one can resist Father's cooking, it's just that delicious. Amy picked up a piece of fish with her chopsticks and placed it into her mouth as she swayed from side to side with an elated smile on her face. Father really is super awesome, anyone who eats his cooking will fall in love with it. Duke Abraham gulped down his saliva as he looked on. There was no way he could eat the grilled fish, and he thought to himself, after this banquet, I'm definitely going to get that chef to make a separate set of braised chicken and rice and spicy grilled fish for me. All three dishes are extremely popular with His Majesty, looks like the best dish of the banquet has already been crowned. Isn't that so? His Highness really has a sharp eye for talent. Speaking of which, that little girl looks so adorable when she's eating. Which family is she from? I heard that Master Crassus recently accepted a half-elf disciple, it's most likely her. I heard that Master Crassus took his disciple to the Magus Tower to wreak havoc yesterday. His disciple broke the Magus Tower's tower ascension record and beat President Richard's disciple to tears. That woman is truly terrifying. All of the officials were discussing quietly among themselves, and their gazes toward Amy had changed significantly. By the time the king put down his chopsticks, he had already eaten more than half of the spicy grilled fish, but the strong sense of satiety still forced him to repress the urge to finish the rest of the grilled fish. He accepted a handkerchief from a waiter and wiped his hands and mouth before looking up at the sweaty Josh and Sean, who were still munching on the grilled fish without a care in the world, and his brows furrowed slightly. Josh and Sean seemed to have sensed the king's gaze, and their expressions changed slightly as they put down their chopsticks in unison. At this point, only the head of the grilled fish remained in front of them. As soon as they stopped, cold sweat began to appear on Josh and Sean's foreheads. The numbness in their lips and the scorching sensation in their throats immediately surged forth, and the scorching sensation made them want to pick up the plate of grilled fish in front of them and take a sip of the spicy soup. Chapter 747. As expected of the best dish. This chef is most likely going to become the new favorite of the royal kitchen. Even the first 3 dishes were so well received by His Majesty. I wonder what His Majesty will reward him with. His Highness is indeed a good judge of character. He must have put in a lot of effort to find such an exceptional chef. The servants quickly went to invite Meg over, and the officials began to discuss quietly among themselves. Many of the second prince's officials naturally wouldn't let go of such a good opportunity to praise Meg. The officials of the first prince's faction did not look too good. The birthday celebration had just begun, and the second prince had already been in the limelight. They did not expect him to make such a strange move. Making a fuss at the palace banquet was out of everyone's expectations. Josh and Sean weren't in the mood to think about that. The scorching sensation on their lips was unbearable, and the burning sensation in their throats was even more unbearable. Sean picked up a glass of wine from the table and downed it in one gulp. Like a catalyst, the burning sensation in his throat became even more intense, and he had to force himself not to spit out the wine. "Get me a flask of ice water and put more ice in it," Josh said to the maid beside him. Josh whispered to the maid beside him. He had tasted the spicy grilled fish 2 days ago, and he had to drink a large pot of ice water to alleviate the spiciness. After drinking the ice water, he felt extremely refreshed. "Master, does that mean Father is going to take first place?" Amy asked as she looked up at Crassus. Crassus nodded with a smile, and replied, "That's right. Mr. Mac's grilled fish has already been designated as the best dish of the day by the king. In other words, it's the best dish of the day, so it's naturally going to take first place." Novin also nodded, and said, "Mr. Mac is a genius. Normally, all chefs who have won the best dish of the day will stay in the palace to become royal chefs. Is Mr. Mac not going back?" Crassus asked. "Mr. Mac will definitely go back." A smile appeared on Novin's face. "Other than discussing the revision of the peace agreement, I'm here to bring Mr. Mac back to Chaos City." Crassus looked at Novin in confusion. "Since when did chefs become strategic resources? You, a dignified 10th-tier great magician, actually made a trip for a chef." Novin smiled but didn't say anything. "As expected of my man. No matter what he does, he always does his best." Irina put down her chopsticks with a satisfied look on her face. She let out a small burp as she wiped her mouth with a silk handkerchief. Although she wouldn't gain weight no matter how much she ate, she hadn't eaten so much in a long time because she couldn't find any food that could make her unable to stop eating. If that's the case, after raising him for 3 years, not only will he learn how to take care of children, but he will also learn how to cook. Then, taking him back seems to be a gain. Irina thought to herself as her gaze fell upon Josh. Her expression turned cold as she said, "However, I'm going to find all of the people who were involved in this incident. I'll skin you alive and let you know what cruelty is." After the 3 dishes were completed, Meg had already begun to clean the kitchen utensils and pack up. He appeared to be quite relaxed. Meg appeared to be very relaxed on the surface, but he was actually feeling a little uneasy. After all, he was here on a mission from the system. If he didn't take first place, it would be very awkward for him to fail the mission. There were too many uncertainties in this mission, and it was purely based on the king's preferences. Although the waiter had said that the king was very satisfied with the first 2 dishes, there was still no way to confirm whether the best dish would be selected. The dishes had already been served, and the bustling cafeteria instantly fell silent. Although there was no need to cook anymore, there weren't many chefs who could wash their pots as leisurely as Meg. All of the chefs were waiting to see who would win the Best Dish award. This was the highest honor in the world of chefs, and everyone who could come here wanted to win this honor. The Best Dish award will definitely go to Master again. Master has already won the Best Dish award for 9 consecutive years. If he wins it again, it will be an unprecedented 10 consecutive wins. Indeed, His Majesty loves eating Master's dishes the most, and that hasn't changed even after so many years. All of the chefs around Bellman wore confident expressions, and they seemed to be ready to celebrate. Bellman's expression was still as calm as ever, and he was carefully wiping his stove with a handkerchief, as if he didn't care about the result at all. Nandel took a glance at Meg, who was cleaning his stove, and said in a slightly peculiar manner, "If you ask me, Master Bellman will definitely win the Best Dish award. The other chefs are still lacking compared to him." Indeed, not just anyone can win the Best Dish award. No one knows His Majesty's preferences better than Master Bellman, Vaser chimed in with a hint of schadenfreude in his smile. They had thought that Meg would really be able to win the Best Dish award for the first 2 dishes, but the spicy aroma of the fish he had cooked was so strong that even they couldn't stand it. All of the chefs present knew that the king didn't like spicy dishes, but Meg had committed this taboo, so perhaps he was going to be reprimanded because of this dish. "Brother Meg, are you really going to be alright after putting so much chili in that fish?" Calulus stood off to the side with reddened eyes as he looked at Meg with a concerned expression. He wasn't crying because he was too pessimistic. Instead, it was because Meg had told him to stand further away when he was putting in the chili, and he didn't pay attention to the spicy aroma. "Indeed, it's so spicy that I can't even open my eyes. I can't see anything now." Luluka and Lukaka narrowed their eyes, and they couldn't even see the small fish anymore. "I'll be fine, I guess." Meg shook his head with a smile. He had put in the king's portion of chili, and he had only added Josh and Sean's portions of insanely spicy. Amy's portion was medium spicy, and Amy's favorite was that level of spiciness. He had also put in the chili for Irina's portion of chili. Elves tended to prefer bland flavors, and Sally's favorite level of chili was medium spicy. As for everyone else, he had put in the super spicy dish. Even if they wanted to hold a grudge, they would most likely hold it against Josh. He was even regretting that he hadn't put in the insanely spicy dish for them. Perhaps this was his selfishness. Meg didn't take Nandel and Vaser's words to heart. This was like a battle between 2 experts. If he were to stomp on a little chick, then he would be lowering his status. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.